Hello, I'm Andy Agafangelo. I'm carrying out this video interview of Mark Bishop in my capacity as chair of the Secretariat Committee to the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fairer Financial Services. I am also, however, the founder of the Transparency Task Force, which acts as the Secretariat to the APPG. Mark, thank you very much indeed for agreeing to have this conversation with me. As you know, the conversation is being video recorded. The video recording will be placed on the APPG's website and will raise awareness of it through social media. You are carrying out this conversation with me, Mark, on the basis that you have already provided a written submission to the APPG's Call for Evidence about the Financial Conduct Authority. So, Mark, could I invite you, please, first of all, to tell us about yourself and outline, just briefly to begin with, how you came to interact with the FCA. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy. Yes, of course. I was an investor in the Connaught Income Fund Series 1, which I'll refer to thereafter as the fund, a collective investment scheme originally promoted and operated by Capita Financial Managers Limited, which I'll refer to as CFM. At the time and now, the UK's largest third-party provider of authorised corporate director, depository, trustee and related services to the financial services sector. I'm the default chair of the fund's liquidators committee and have played the central role in its action group. Prior to this, I had never worked in the financial services industry or had any dealings with the FSA or FCA, so my relationship with the regulator came with no preconceptions, good or bad, and no agenda. My first contact with the Financial Services Now Conduct Authority took place on or around the 4th of July 2012, prompted by me identifying evidence of misconduct and regulatory failure in relation to the fund, which had been suspended some 4 months earlier.
Thank you, Mark. And what had you invested in and when and what went wrong?
Well, in January 2010, I had invested in the Connaught Income Fund Series 1, which was originally named the Guaranteed Low Risk Investment Fund Series 1.
And if you're happy to mention it, Mark, how much did you invest and how much of that money do you have left?
I invested £300,000. Between the fund's suspension in March 2012 and late 2018, approximately 75% of that capital was returned through recoveries, including litigation, by the liquidators and a partial redress scheme negotiated between the FCA and Capita plc, which had owned the fund's original operator CFM, under which up to £66 million, in fact around £57 million, was paid to investors. Unfortunately, I and other investors also lost significant amounts of income or returns on our capital. The fund guaranteed an annual income of a little over 8%, roughly in line with the long-run returns and investment into a vanilla all-share tracker and the 8% figure used by the Financial Ombudsman Service when calculated interest on redress payments. Such a rate of return applied to the outstanding balance and compounded from the time the investment was made to date, we come to a larger principal than a larger figure than the principal invested. I would argue that our forfeit returns are actually greater than this, because 8% or thereabouts is appropriate to a highly liquid investment that pays periodic distributions and that allows near immediate access to the capital if required. The fund turned out to be hugely illiquid, and it's reasonable to expect to receive an illiquidity premium. My private equity investments return around 35% per year, and my angel investments north of 50%. The fund has turned out to be less liquid than the former and only slightly more liquid than the latter. Over and above the returns on capital, I and others who invested in the fund have suffered further financial harms. Some have experienced consequential losses arising from the inability to access income or capital, while others, me especially, have incurred very substantial time costs investigating what happened and campaigning for appropriate remedies. Finally, in my case, there's also the question of future career earnings. Once it became clear that the fund failed because of a toxic combination of criminality, negligence and cover-up, spanning scammers outside and on the periphery of the regulatory perimeter, a large firm very much within it, and the regulator itself, I realised that it would take a very specific combination of skills, determination and time to unpick it all. I couldn't see anyone else suitably equipped stepping up to lead this process, so I did so. In deciding to devote myself to that fight, I walked away from a very well-paid career, including a hugely promising new business, that it soon became clear would not receive the time or investment it deserved, while I poured time into fighting for the interests of the 2,000 victims and rebalanced my capital to provide me with sufficient passive income to be able to give up work for a time. I'm very fortunate to have been able to build up sufficient financial resources to give me that option, but that good fortune reflects the income I had been earning, and therefore is a measure of the future earnings I chose to sacrifice in order to stand up for what's right. Back then, I could never have imagined that I would still be fighting more than 10 years later. Had I done so, I wonder whether I might simply have written off my losses and left my fellow investors to sink or swim. But actually, I'm pleased I persevered. In doing so, I have met people and been exposed to thinking that I would otherwise not have encountered. And I've also developed a level of understanding of the regulatory flaws that made possible not just high-profile cases such as Connaught and LCF, and the many instances of mistreatment of SMEs by banks, but also the dozens of other scams and mis-selling that received less publicity. I now recognise that the path I've travelled on has put me in an almost uniquely advantaged position when it comes to making the case for reform, which in turn places a moral obligation on me to do so. This career path means that I've spent the years from my early 40s to early 50s, for most men our peak earning period, largely doing voluntary investigatory and campaigning work. I now find myself, age 53, relatively unemployable, at least at the level at which I was working when the fund was suspended, let alone where I might reasonably have expected to have progressed to a decade or so later had I followed the trajectory I was on. I took this route willingly, aware of the risks and possible costs, but it is absolutely clear that the fund failed largely or wholly because of extensive regulatory failure, I believe also cover-up, that a reasonably competent regulator acting in good faith on the information and with the powers available to it at the time would have prevented the fund from coming into existence, and even if it had failed to do so, would have closed it down long before I invested, and that the redress I received, also the redress received by investors to date, would never have been returned without the work I've done. For these reasons, I gently but firmly observe that the sum I've lost, including the very significant falling income I expect to incur for the rest of my working life, is a result of the decision to stand up for myself and others who lost money as a result of the FSA's and FCA's shortcomings, and so is down to the FCA. I therefore hope that any eventual remediation package from the FCA or the Treasury includes recognition of these exceptional losses I've suffered. I make this point in the knowledge that the cost must fall on the financial services industry, the taxpayer, or some mix of the two. The former normally benefits from complacent and captured regulation. It is right that it should from time to time have to pick up the bills for the negative externalities that flow from such laxity. And the latter, the public, voted for successive governments of different political compositions that created this serially incapable, opaque, unaccountable, and even dishonest regulator, and consistently ignored ample evidence that it was unfit for purpose for a very long time. So there is also a compelling case for socialising the costs. Either way, the financial costs of regulatory failure cannot continue to be borne on the narrow shoulders of the immediate victims, of which I'm one. And as a wider observation, I believe it's essential that those among the victims of financial services misconduct and regulatory failure who campaign for improvements and the whistleblowers who try and prevent or curtail such problems are compensated, and that the redress they receive is on the generous side of fair, and that such payments are made public. I say this because I know that the path for them can be long and tortuous, and it's essential that others considering whether or not to embark on a similar journey can see that if they're right, and if they do the right thing, they will ultimately be treated well by the nation. I'm 10 years into this fight, and the principal whistleblower in the Connaught case, George Patelis, is more than 11 years in. Leaving us out in the cold sends an appalling message to others who find themselves facing the same choice as we did. For that reason alone, and not for ourselves, redress must now be swift, generous, and public. One of the deepest injustices about financial regulation in the UK is that there is, in the main, no means by which those who lose money as a result of regulatory failure can obtain financial redress. Later in the document, I explain why I believe parliamentary intervention to remedy this situation is not only essential for equity and natural justice, but is in fact a necessary precondition for fixing the FCA.
Mark, thank you very much indeed for that. So just before we move on to the next question, there's a footnote in your written submission where you refer to mis-selling being a euphemism. Would you like to elaborate on that for us, please?
Yeah, I mean, outside of financial services, I've never heard the term mis-selling, and it seems to me that it's usually in financial services a euphemism for fraud. Fraud by misrepresentation, by material omission or abuse of position. I've often said, in fact, I've said it in a presentation to the FCA, if they witnessed an armed bank robbery, they would not call it misborrowing or a non-compliant personal loan application. So why does this euphemism become acceptable when it's the other side that's perpetrating the wrongs?
Thank you, Mark. Thank you very much. Okay, we're on to question number 4. Back to your case. So what was supposed to happen and what actually happened as far as you know?
Well, a complete answer to this question would exceed the word length limit for responses to the entire question set. So I'll give you the short version. The fund was marketed as a bridging loan fund. Investors would lend their money to the fund, an English limited partnership, which would then lend it to a diversified mix of high quality borrowers for bridging loans. A bridging loan is recognised by the industry as a loan on a residential property in a state fit for occupation and occupied by its owners, and not requiring works for which planning permission is needed, having a duration of not more than 6 months, intended to bridge the overlap between the purchase of a new home and the sale of a previous one. Such loans are typically more expensive than conventional mortgages. Those backed by the fund were made at an average APR of 17.9%, providing sufficient returns to enable the fund's investors to receive returns of a little over 8%, and for the parties involved in operating the fund and making the loans to also generate sustainable returns. Measures were supposedly in place to limit loan-to-value ratios and ensure there were first charges on property, and guarantees were offered in respect of both income and capital by the parties involved in running the fund. What actually happened is described in some detail in Raj Parker's external review, which I linked to from my testimony document, into the regulator's handling of the case. Briefly, the fund was a Ponzi-style fraud in which many of the loans, which were in fact almost all development funding, a much riskier, less liquid, unregulated category of lending, were made to refinance previous non-performing loans or were provided to connected parties, or both, often at increasingly fictitious valuations and underpinned by little or no tangible security. Sometimes loans were approved, in inverted commas, but never proceeded with, but monies were drawn down nonetheless by Toyota PLC, which I'll call Toyota thereafter. That's the party responsible for identifying and approving borrowers. Or when loans were redeemed, in inverted commas, proceeds were retained by Toyota. Toyota failed to operate a separate client account for these monies, a very basic requirement of an authorised firm, so they were commingled with the firm's own resources and used to meet its operating costs, including the lifestyle costs of the principals. Borrowers included convicted fraudsters, one of whom had been jailed, and people with learning difficulties. Loan-to-value ratios were ignored, valuations were clearly fraudulent, charges on properties either absent or defective, and audits negligent or dishonest. This was made possible by the fund's operator, CFM, taking on and promoting the fund with literally no due diligence into the fund or its counterparties, and with only minimal oversight of or involvement in how the fund actually operated, which differed materially from the description in the information memorandum issued by the operator and regulated financial promotion. When CFM realised what had happened, it and the FSA jointly sought a new operator so CFM could rid itself of the business and, it hoped, any resulting liability. After 2 false starts, that is, firms that agreed to take on the role but walked away within days when they spotted problems with the fund, a new operator, Bluegate Capital Limited, I'll call it BGC thereafter, agreed to handle the matter. Another capital subsidiary continued acting as custodian of client assets until the FSA could grant BGC the necessary permissions, and CFM provided a seconded employee to help BGC administer the handover. At no stage was there full disclosure by either CFM or the FSA of the problems both knew existed with the fund, either to the new operator or to investors. This new investment continued to be, new investment continued to be attracted into the fund, and the commingling and dissipation of monies proceeded unabated. As a result of this, By the end of 2011, less than 4 years after the fund's launch, and despite having raised more than £100 million from investors, the fund was unable to honour the quarterly income distribution, which required less than £2 million in cash, without support from another of the parties involved. The following quarter, March 2012, it was unable to pay, so the fund was suspended. Between January 2011 and the fund suspension in March 2012, the FSA was fully aware that Toyota had been stealing investors' money, that it was insolvent on a cash flow and balance sheet basis, and that it was in breach of its capital adequacy requirements and multiple other threshold conditions, yet it allowed it to trade.
Thank you. And again, just before we move on to the next question, Mark, Toyota sounds a bit like a car manufacturer, but clearly it's not the car manufacturer. Toyota is spelled T-I-U-T-A. Thank you very much, Mark. On to question number 5. What, if anything, do you believe the FCA could have done that may have prevented you from allegedly being scammed in the first place?
Well, this is another question that alone could cause me to exceed the allocated 10,000 word limit to answer in full. I've already linked to Raj Parker's external review, which devotes 55,129 words to the topic. Like many other victims, I think it's a partial whitewash, and it barely scrapes the surface in terms of the full extent of the regulatory failure and cover-up. But even with those reservations, it identifies more than enough flaws in the regulator's performance to be confident that a reasonably competent regulator acting in good faith on the basis of the information and powers available to it at the time would have prevented me and almost 2,000 Commonwealth investors being scammed. These shortcomings include, but are not limited to, authorising Toyota despite knowing that its corporate controller, in inverted commas, had previously attempted to defraud HMRC by falsifying invoices and failing to supervise it to a minimally competent standard. Failing to prosecute the founder and sole shareholder of Connaught Asset Management Limited, which I'll call CAM, Nigel Walter, for operating an illegal collective investment scheme, namely UK Land Investments, which I'll call UKLI thereafter, a boiler room scam that defrauded consumers of some £69 million. I've linked to a report about it in the written testimony, and failing to track his actions after he applied unsuccessfully for FSA authorisation. Failing to act on an alert from Jersey's financial services regulator and another from a consumer. Ignoring and subsequently losing, supposedly, I don't believe this is true, alerts from 3 whistleblowers. Failing to act appropriately in response to concerns raised about the systems and governance of CFM in respect of accounting errors and alleged fraud in another collective investment scheme for which it was responsible, namely Arch Crew. The FSA required CFM to commission a report under Section 166 of the Financial Services Markets Act, known as Section 166 report, into its systems and processes. Even today, the FCA refuses to disclose that report in response to freedom of information requests. We respect it paints a picture of systemic shortcomings that were never remedied, and wonder if it even identifies UCITS products, perhaps even the fund, as an area of concern. If this is true, it would cast new light on why CFM resigned its role as the fund's operator in 2009 and raises serious questions about the extent to which the decision may have been prompted by the FSA and how much the FSA knew about the risk to investors in the fund at that time. Immediately thereafter, facilitating the transfer by CFM of the fund to at least 2 operators, both of whom immediately resigned upon identifying problems with the product, and the third, BGC, that did not. Failing to act on repeated evidenced allegations that CAM was conducting unregulated business despite being unauthorised, and that the promotions for the fund were misleading, despite knowing that the firm was led by a known fraudster. Identifying late and failing to act when it became aware that Toyota's compliance manager, Mike Davies, was also the chairman of CAM, an obvious conflict of interest and a flag pointing to collusion between the two. Allowing Toyota to be supervised by a friend and former colleague of Mike Davies, another very obvious conflict of interest. Ignoring evidence that BGC may have been trading while insolvent, allowing both it and, I would argue, CAM to operate with insufficient balance sheet strength and professional indemnity insurance to meet any liabilities that might arise, a breach of the threshold conditions. Ignoring concerns expressed by BGC that the fund might be trading while insolvent. Failing to failing to act appropriately on a SUP 15/Principle 11 alert from George Patelis, Chief Executive Officer of Toyota, that he had concerns about the solvency of Toyota, which was substantiated by an independent report by insolvency specialists from BDO LLP, which I'll just call BDO. There were risks to client monies belonging to the fund. Toyota's systems and records were defective, and his fellow directors were conducting themselves with a lack of probity. After George Patelis resigned from Toyota and returned to his native New York, and the FSA required him to return to London at short notice and deliver up to them any evidence he held that substantiated his concerns. When he did so, it inexplicably refused to accept handover of an entire suitcase of such documentation. Refusing to require Toyota to go into administration, despite advice from BDO that this should happen, overruling an FSA employee whose clear recommendation was that an insolvency process was required. Thereafter, allowing Toyota to continue to trade, further dissipating the fund's money, relying on subsequent reports from BDO, which it knew were paid for by Toyota from the fund's resources, which contained prominent disclaimers to the effect that those reports were based solely on inputs from Toyota's management, about which the FSA already knew there were grounds for concern, and that BDO had undertaken no work of its own to establish the true financial position nor the deliverability of any claimed turnaround plans. Overruling a supervisor who expressed the opinion that investors in the fund should be notified of concerns about the solvency of Toyota, not least because the firm was a provider of a guarantee to the fund's investors, which was unlikely to be unable to honour. Publishing a grossly inadequate and misleading arse-covering statement on its website, requiring Toyota to cease all regulated, i.e. bridging loan lending, by implication endorsing the unregulated development finance lending that was jeopardising the fund's investors' money, and which breached the description of the use of capital provided in the regulated promotions. The fund's investors were never notified of this change. It was buried on Toyota's entry on the FSA register. Requiring Toyota this was seemingly driven by reputational concerns. The FSA believed that its own position could be enhanced by being able to argue that the small proportion of regulated lending had ceased. This technique of encouraging a firm to run down regulated activity and even to reverse the firm's authorization is a ploy the FSA/FCA has used in other cases to create plausible deniability of itself in cases where there has been misconduct enabled by regulatory failure. Requiring Toyota to return to the fund the proceeds of all loan redemptions, a requirement that proves the FSA knew that such monies were not being retained, were being retained by Toyota, essentially theft. No attempt was made to notify the police or other law enforcement agencies of this criminality. The FSA, I should say, varied Toyota's permission in June 2012, far too late. The variation required Toyota to return redemption money to the appropriate funder when a loan redeemed. It was added 3 months after the fund was suspended and 17 months after the FSA first knew Toyota was using redemption money for its own purposes. Surely evidence of the FSA trying to create an evidence trail after the event, falsely implying that it had been on top of what was happening. Mistakenly believing that CAM was regulated by the Guernsey Financial Services Commission, when in fact it was a UK-based company. So if, as was the case, the firm should have been authorised, the authorisation should have come from the FSA itself. These are just a few examples of what happened prior to and during the fund's life. I have not rehashed what happened after it was suspended in March 2012, since you've asked at this stage about how my losses might have been prevented, not how monies might have been recovered and steps taken to protect others and deter misconduct. Parker's review is fairly helpful on these points up to the FCA imposed cut-off date of March 2015. There has to date been no third-party analysis of events since then. In my view, such an exercise would raise even more grave concerns about the competence and in particular the integrity of the regulator than Parker's one looking at an earlier period. In particular, any such exercise would have to answer some very difficult questions, including, why did the regulator try to pin the blame on the independent financial advisors who put clients into the fund, despite 2 sets of legal advice indicating they were not culpable? Why did the FCA rule out in June 2013 using its enforcement powers against any of the parties involved? A position we know to be incorrect, since we subsequently bullied and blackmailed it into reversing its stance and found that there were regulatory breaches by both operators, CFM and BGC. There were breaches by other parties that have not been subject to such investigations. Why did the FCA refuse to issue a restitution order against CFM, which had deep pockets, but obtained a Pyrrhic one against BGC, which did not? Why have there been no fines, removals of permissions or from the register or prosecutions or of any of the authorised persons, firms and individuals involved, almost a decade on? And why have none of those outside the regulatory perimeter been prosecuted, whether for criminality or for conducting regulated activities without being authorised to do so, despite ample evidence against multiple parties? Why, until the publication of the Parker Review in December 2020, did the FCA refuse to acknowledge any negligence or dishonesty in its handling of the case, both during the fund's life and subsequently, especially given that its own internal review, circulated Feb 2016, apparently identifies multiple failings? Why is the FCA's senior leadership team now falsely claiming that Connaught investors have been compensated in full by the partial redress scheme it negotiated with CFM and Capita in November 2017, and that resulted in payments being made approximately a year later, when it's self-evident that such losses still exist? Why did the FCA allegedly persuade or even compel Woodford Investment Management to use CFM as its authorised corporate director, ACD, for its flagship equity income fund, given what the FCA knew about CFM because of the Arch Crew and later Connaught cases? And why did Chris Martin, a key member of the regulator's complex events team that supposedly investigated the fund's collapse but didn't in reality, wind up as compliance manager at Woodford, where he seemingly had no problem with the choice of AFM?
Thank you very much indeed, Mark. There are several footnotes at the bottom of page 8, Mark, and at the bottom of page 9. You've referred to one or two of them. I invite you, please, Mark, just to glance back at the bottom of page 8 and the bottom of page 9, just to bring to life any of the footnotes that you haven't yet referred to that you might wish to do so.
Yeah, I mean, I think, broadly speaking, the main points have been brought forward. I think, yeah, I think okay.
That's great. Okay, thank you very much. So I'm going to now move on to the next question, which is question number 6. What interaction have you had with the FCA about what happened, Mark?
Well, okay. As you would expect, given my roles with the Action Group and the Fund's Liquidators Committee, I've had extensive dealings with the FCA and the FSA before it over the past 9.5 or more years, from call centre level to that of successive CEOs. I'll therefore focus on some notable events and my observations thereon in broadly chronological order, rather than try and provide an exhaustive list. I mentioned in response to question 1 that my first interaction with the FSA came in early July 2012, when I phoned in to report initial evidence that the fund had failed due to a combination of misconduct and regulatory failure. The switchboard put me through to Lorraine Wadhams, who was supervising Toyota, that one being an authorised firm and the epicentre of the alleged fraud. Her reaction to my call was unexpected, to put it mildly. She refused to accept evidence from me or to meet with me or other members of the nascent Action Group, who had also begun to look into what had happened. The unspoken message was, go away, we're in charge and we'll decide whether and how this gets investigated. So unusual, in fact, was her response and so unhelpful that I became suspicious and started to investigate. I noticed from Wadham's LinkedIn profile that she'd previously worked at a subprime mortgage lender called Infinity Mortgages, a name that rang a bell. So I checked the profiles of some of the Connaught nominals and soon realised she'd worked there alongside Mike Davies, who is both the compliance manager of Toyota and the chairman of CAM. So Wadhams was supervising and now presumably investigating a firm whose compliance manager was a former colleague and who may have also been the link in any suspected collusion between that firm and CAM. Could this explain why she was so reluctant to engage with an external stakeholder who might have evidence against that firm? A few weeks later, the Action Group published a blog entry, I've linked to it in my written testimony, entitled Poacher and Gamekeeper Getting Familiar, ? Which highlighted legitimate concerns about the implications for conflict of interest management at the regulator and for the regulator's investigation of what happened to the fund. The FSA's response to this blog was not to eliminate the potential conflict of interest by moving Wadhams, but rather to engage notoriously aggressive and expensive libel lawyers Carter Ruck to send me a letter threatening litigation. I pointed out that I didn't own the domain name of the blog site, I didn't host the website or control its content, and I offered to pass on the correspondence to the site's editor. I should mention that, fortuitously, a prescient member of the action group had anticipated the risk of litigation and had arranged for all three aspects of ownership and control of the website to be based in the United States, where freedom of speech legislation would put it largely out of reach of such claims. The editor responded to the FSA with a without prejudice offer of a right to reply if it could demonstrate that any part of the disputed blog entry was factually incorrect. Unsurprisingly, the offer was never taken up, no evidence presented, but questions such as how much the FSA spent on Carter Ruck and whether threatening an action group that was exposing regulatory failure was an appropriate response or an acceptable use of levy monies have never been answered. Thereafter, updates to the action group website often contained barbed references to its American links, trolling the FSA/FCA by pointing out that the site could not be bullied into silence about events that were and are uncomfortable for the regulator. Soon after the Carter Ruck episode, I wrote to the then Chief Executive Hector Sanz, who passed my correspondence to Norsca Delfas, who was the overall head of the regulator's complex events team. I'll call it CET. So far as I can determine, complex is a euphemism for reputationally challenging for the FCA, in that CET existed to deal with cases that were politically sensitive, perhaps because there was the suspicion or actuality of regulatory failure or capture, which might make it difficult to pass them to enforcement for investigation and action. I suspect that CET had previously been involved in cases such as Key Data and Arch Crew, and I know that it negotiated or implemented the widely criticised interest rate hedging product scheme confirmed by John Swift's independent review, which was highly critical of the regulator's decisions not to impose restitution orders or a redress scheme, and its decision to introduce sophistication tests to the voluntary scheme that had the effect of denying redress to around a third of the cases by volume, but 3/4 by value, for which there was no basis in law or the regulations. And it was also involved in another heavily contested project, namely the investigation into the actions of RBS's global restructuring group. I met and corresponded with Delfas and her team on a number of occasions in the autumn of 2012. They encouraged me to pass on to them any evidence I held or became aware of, and to persuade others to do the same. One key piece of evidence I provided to them at the time was a set of minutes, I've linked to them from my written testimony, of a meeting between the principals of CFM and those of CAM that took place in September 2009, in which the former shared with the latter their concerns about the fund, which they cited as reasons for wanting to terminate CFM's role as its operator. This was significant for 4 reasons. First, the principals of CFM should have made a Principle 11 disclosure to the FSA about those concerns. If they did so, we needed to know why the FSA did not intervene to ensure the fund was suspended, the loans redeemed, and any shortfall met by CFM. And if CFM did not make a Principle 11 disclosure, it would be in a clear breach of its regulatory obligations, which had profound implications for its liability to the fund's investors. Given this proof that CFM knew that there were grave problems with the fund, we also needed to know whether those concerns were shared with or withheld from the firms that were trying to line up to take over the operator role. If they were withheld, again, that could form the basis of regulatory action against CFM. 3, we knew that CFM withheld those concerns from the fund's investors and that it misled them about the true reasons for its decision to cease being the operator. It cited a strategic decision to move away from UCITS products. Had it told the truth, the fund would either have been suspended or fixed. The decision to withhold this information and lie to customers would also provide grounds for regulatory action. 4, it meant that losses incurred by investors after that meeting and after BGC were also the result of CFM's behaviour during its period as operator, and not just those actions that took place prior to the meeting or during its operatorship. I should add that the only circumstances I can envisage in which the receipt of this information would not be seized gratefully by the FSA and immediately used as grounds to commence an enforcement investigation leading to the issuance of a restitution order requiring CFM to compensate the fund investors for the totality of the losses, and to other remedies that would have removed the firm from the register, hence the industry, or would have removed its leadership team and required the firm to undergo significant change under new managers, would be if the regulator had been an active and engaged party in the decisions made by CFM at the time. Or, to put it more bluntly, the only reason I can think of why the FSA would not immediately go for CFM's jugular is if the FSA had endorsed or even encouraged CFM in its decision to walk away from the fund without disclosing the problems to new operators or consumers. I speculate in answering question 7 about why the regulator might have wanted CFM to behave in that way, if that's what happened. While I stress that I have no specific evidence that this is what happened, the FSA's response to my disclosure of the crucial minutes was wholly consistent with this hypothesis and made no sense whatsoever if you believe the regulator was and is a good faith actor genuinely interested in getting redress for mistreated investors and keen to protect other consumers from authorised persons who breach regulations. I was politely thanked for providing the minutes, but that's all that happened. I had hoped, perhaps even expected, that I'd be invited in to talk about how I came by them, how I knew they were genuine, whether I could introduce them to the person who provided them to me, whether that person might be a conduit to other evidence. None of that happened then, and none of it has taken place since, almost a decade later. Rightly or wrongly, I took this as a signal that the FSA was itself in some way compromised. A picture was beginning to form of an organisation that wanted me to provide information, not so it could investigate the firms and individuals involved, but because it wanted to know what I knew for its own reputational and risk management purposes. And indeed, we now know from the Parker report that the FSA's first instincts was to scapegoat independent financial advisors, IFAs, through whom the fund was distributed, and that a key committee, known as ERIC, decided as early as June 2013 that the regulator would not use its enforcement powers against any of the firms or senior managers involved. It also recommended that this decision be communicated to investors. This never happened. And indeed, the regulator continued to give the impression that it was investigating and was contemplating such action. Had we been notified of the decision at the time, we might well have taken it to judicial review. My response was to put more of the information in the public domain. I suggested to the Action Group website's American editor that a blog on the CFM minutes might be in order. You can read it using a link that I provided in my testimony. Even now, I find it both alarming and deeply suspicious that the FSA/FCA did not immediately launch an enforcement investigation, and I consider it to be one of the many flaws of the Parker report that it doesn't address the question of why this didn't happen. I should mention that the FCA changed a key aspect of its procedures in relation to interacting with consumers a little time after my experience with Wadhams. It instructed its phone operators not to put through calls from consumers to named departments or individuals, but rather to direct them to its call centre. While I can't prove that this happened as a result of the aforementioned incident, I can say that it caused me immense frustration. There were several occasions when I needed to speak with FCA officers and instead had to deal with poorly recruited, ill-trained, disempowered, demotivated functionaries from the call centre, operating inflexibly to predetermined response scripts. So it didn't surprise me to read in Dame Elizabeth Gloucester's report into the collapse of London Capital and Finance plc that the call centre missed hundreds of opportunities to escalate upward concerns expressed by consumers about that firm, and on many occasions gave them incorrect information and flawed advice. As a result of this policy change, on the occasions when I've had to speak with specific individuals at the FCA latterly, I've had to implement a workaround. I phone the FCA switchboard. Its personnel, of course, don't give out direct numbers, and I pretend to be a senior executive from an authorised firm in order to be put through. It speaks volumes to me that the culture of the FCA that it has instituted, about the culture of the FCA, that it's instituted policy that literally prevents its people from hearing the voices of consumers while then allowing it to continue to being exposed to those of the industry. Another touch point between the regulator and myself in autumn 2012 was my request for there to be a review of the regulator's handling of the case. By then I was aware of many shortcomings, and I guessed that there were far more of which I was as yet unaware. My motivations were twofold. First, if I could establish that there was regulatory failure rather than just incompetence, whether due to incompetence, dishonesty, or both, evidence of the same might lead to the payment by the regulator or the Treasury of redress. Second, whether or not such an investigation led to financial remedies for the fund's investors, it would provide transparency about regulatory shortcomings, which ought to lead to improvements that would result in other consumers being better protected and served in the future. Unfortunately, the FSA refused, arguing that an investigation might impair its ability to investigate the firms. Given that we now know that the FSA was not actually investigating at that point and did not intend doing so, that response was, in my view, dishonest. It came from Norsika Delfas, who went on to become the FCA's Chief Operating Officer. She is now the Acting Chief Executive Officer and Chief Ombudsman of the Financial Ombudsman Service, and I have reason to believe that it's in the intention of the FCA's board that this secondment will in time be made permanent. Whether this happens or not, I believe the FCA is already in breach of its obligation under Section 2125 of the Financial Services and Markets Act 2000, which obliges the FCA to appoint to the Ombudsman a Chief Executive who is independent of the regulator. Between then and 2014, my focus was on placing stories in the media and briefing politicians with the intention of encouraging them to ask questions of the Minister in correspondence and in the House, and for there to be a relevant parliamentary debate. The idea was to put pressure on the FCA to proceed with its claims strategy, which was to lean on Capita, parent of CFM, to reach a negotiated settlement. I met with Delfas and her direct report, Simone Ferreira, on the 10th of December 2014 to express my concerns about the implementation of that strategy. I doubted that Capita would pay up because there had been no enforcement investigation, and hence the FCA did not have sufficient evidence of wrongdoing by the firm for it to believe that a restitution order, fines, prosecutions, and removal of permissions would follow if it refused to compensate victims. Sadly, that fear was justified because negotiations, which had begun in July 2014 and been extended several times, broke up without a settlement in March 2015. Another factor in that failure, which I believe I must bring to your attention as it has a bearing on my assessment of the individuals involved, is an interview, I've linked to it in the testimony, given by the then Chief Executive of the FCA, Martin Wheatley, to Money Marketing magazine, published on the 8th of January 2015. And that was a sensitive time for the negotiations between the regulator and Capita. In it, he said the following, and I quote, "Given the problems we've had with Archcrew and Connaught, it is interesting whether those products would have been sold in a world where there was not that commission payback to IFAs. There clearly is a cost to the RDR, the Retail Distribution Review, which banned these commissions, but I hope there will be benefits. One of the benefits, frankly, is fewer scandals that fall on the Financial Services Compensation Scheme and then the industry. It's my view that it was grossly inappropriate for Wheatley to make any public statement about the underlying causation of the fund's collapse, while a team from the FCA was engaged in protracted negotiations with the parent of the deep-pocketed authorised firm clearly responsible for those losses, let alone for him wrongly and knowingly so. I say knowingly because the Parker Review confirms that the FSA received not one but two sets of legal advice following the fund's collapse, confirming that IFAs were not the underlying cause of investors' loss, to ascribe blame on IFAs. Unfortunately, Parker is silent on whether Wheatley was just a fool out of his depth or whether the interview was some kind of signal to Capita that the regulator had its back. Either way, the FCA went to those negotiations without the collateral it needed to succeed, and its already weak negotiating position was fatally undermined by its own CEO. Small wonder it wasted a further 9 months achieving nothing of value. The upside of this failure is that it provided us with the leverage necessary to finally get the enforcement investigation commissioned in March 2015 that should have started in 2012. Actually, it should have started in Jan 2011 when George Patelis blew the whistle, or probably even in 2009 when the operator's role was resigned by CFM against the background of an FSA-mandated Section 166 report following the collapse of Archcrew. But I'm going from the date on which I first provided evidence and that I knew at the time constituted grounds for starting such an investigation. In effect, the purpose of the political and media campaign between 2012 and the end of 2014 and my correspondence with the FSA/FCA during that time was to bully and blackmail the regulator into going down the enforcement route. We were in effect saying, we've given you ample evidence of wrongdoing. If you don't act, we'll be going after you for not acting instead of the firms for their misconduct. To save yourselves, you have to throw your partners in crime to the lions. Your choice. Classic case of the prisoner's dilemma in game theory. The handover to enforcement came at an interesting time because Mark Stewart had recently been appointed to lead that department. A wiry, perhaps even pugilistic Australian, Stewart is, for good or ill, quite different to the other senior FSA/FCA executives I've dealt with. Many would disagree with my assessment, but he's probably the only person I've encountered at or near the top of the organisation who doesn't strike me as a high-functioning sociopath who smoothly trots out the party line about being a proactive, pro-consumer organisation while actually deploying sophisticated passive resistance to protect the regulator, industry wrongdoers, or both. Stewart began attending periodic meetings of the Fund's Liquidators Committee. He explained early on that he'd removed many members of the team initially tasked with the enforcement investigation on the basis that they were conflicted and replaced them by his own choices. Some of them fellow Aussies, presumably from ASIC, where he began his regulatory career. Obviously, it's concern that those he removed were ever deemed acceptable team members, but his admission and action provided some early grounds for cautious optimism. Unfortunately, the investigation took longer than we might ideally have liked, until November 2017, so 2 years and 8 months. The final notice, which I'll link to in the testimony, was less critical than it might have been. CFM breached far more principles than the two identified in the final notice. And the voluntary redress package fell far short of putting victims in the position they would have been in had they not invested in the fund. The intention of the settlement was supposedly to return to investors their initial capital, less any income distributions received during the fund's life and the amounts of capital returned since its suspension. For investors to have been put in the position they would have been had they not invested in the fund, the income received during its life would not have been deducted, and they would also have had to have been compensation for the consequential losses and opportunity costs identified in my answer to question 3. Coincidentally, or perhaps not, the settlement was followed by the award of a valuable multi-year contract by the Financial Services Compensation Scheme, which is under the general management oversight of the FCA, to Capita PLC to provide outsourced claims management services. A backdoor bung from another member of the 3F's regulatory family under the FCA's control in return for Capita coughing up controversial circumstances, I wonder. The announcement of the redress scheme was a step forward, but critically, based on the interactions we had with Stewart at the time, it was not intended to be the end of the story. Conversely, the FCA had publicly stated that other enforcement work was ongoing into BGC and perhaps into other parties. Stewart was forthright about the fact that he would not continue such work unless there was realistic prospect of material financial upside, a clear signal that we should expect further redress from his team's continuing efforts. Sadly, this was not to be. On the 18th of December 2020, the FCA published its final notice, I've linked to it, summarising the outcome of its investigation into BGC. Ironically, given the absence of a restitution order in the far more serious CFM case, there was one awarded against BGC, but only for £203,007. This was not only a derisory sum, but a liability the firm couldn't meet. By then, its minimal balance sheet and insufficient professional indemnity insurance. When I say that, the inadequacy of it should have resulted in it breaching the threshold conditions years ago. I would argue the firm should never have been authorised, should certainly never have been the operator of a UCITS fund with £100 million in it, with known problems, raising further questions about the competence of both authorisations and supervision teams in respect of the fund. So that money in the balance sheet and in the indemnity insurance have been dissipated, and so far there is no suggestion that the FSCS will make good the shortfall. Worrying, the FCA's accompanying announcement, which I've linked to, repeated the lie that the 2017 Capita settlement had put investors as closely as possible in the position they would have been in had they not invested in the fund. This followed the FCA's response to the Parker review published the previous day, which misleadingly implied, but didn't state, that Connaught investors had recovered at least their initial capital. I emailed Nick Elrati asking him to retract those two statements and publish a suitable correction. He refused. So I submitted a formal complaint, which I linked to in my testimony, about both the statements and the refusal to correct them. The FCA is supposed to respond to complaints, having investigated, quotes, as quickly as possible, providing its findings or setting out an alternative reasonable timescale within 4 weeks. It took the FCA almost 7 months to reject my complaint. linked to the grounds for rejection. Well, in short, the presumption that the statement accompanying the CFM settlement had to be right, and therefore any empirical fact that investors in the fund were still out of pocket had to be untrue. Obviously, the position is incorrect. If nothing else, would Stewart and his team have spent several years on an enforcement investigation into BGC if they didn't believe there were unremedied losses? My guess is that he believed he could obtain a much larger restitution order against the firm, which he could then pass on to the FSCS once the firm defaulted, resulting in the losses being socialised in the industry. If so, I speculate that BGC's management argued, not without some justification, that they were set up as the fall guys by CFM, and perhaps also the FSA, when it became clear that the fund was toxic, and CFM wanted to be out of the picture when the money ran out, as it inevitably would. If this is the case, I suspect that any attempt by Stewart to secure a material restitution order would have been thrown out by the Regulatory Decisions Committee, the upper tribunal or court, on the grounds that CFM or the regulator or both were the underlying cause of loss. So in pursuing BGC, the FCA may have been attempting to divert attention away from its failure to pursue a restitution order against CFM, which may of course have been rendered impossible by its own role in the operator handover, and thus ultimately been trying, in the end unsuccessfully, to avoid the liability returning to its own door. The interactions I've described, with the exception of me asking for a review of the regulator's behaviour in 2012, largely describe the major touch points in the process of trying to obtain financial redress for the fund's victims. I should also mention the other main work stream, namely the battle to encourage or compel the FCA or FSA/FCA to learn from past failings. Having had my request for a review of the regulator's performance rebuffed in 2012, ever since then I've watched and learned and noticed a number of other cases in which the regulator has not performed with the competence, proactivity or integrity that I believe the public has a right to expect. These include the many instances of poor treatment of small businesses by banks, the tail end of the PPI scandal, the mistreatment of whistleblowers such as the late Paul Moore, Nicholas Wilson, Paul Carlier, John Banerjee, Sally Masterton, and Joanne Russo. Many other investment scams, for example, Ready to Invest, Lendy, Funding Secure and Collateral, Store First and Part First, Secured Energy Bonds, Blackmore Bonds, Bentley Global and X-Mount, and of course the big one, Woodford. Payment systems problems, authorised push payment frauds particularly, and much, much more. During this time, since the inception of the FCA in 2013, I have written to every chief executive of the organisation, both interim and permanent, requesting a meeting in order that I can share with them some observations about areas in which the regulator might raise its game based on my observations in Connaught and other cases. Not one has agreed to such a meeting. Most recently, Nikhil Rathi turned me down. So, he may claim that he's trying to change the organisation, but there's no evidence of it that I can see. When he later made some public comments suggesting that he was committed to improving the FCA's diversity of thinking, I approached him again, offering a much shorter meeting to discuss 5 easily actionable proposals aimed at achieving that goal alone. He refused. Does he really want to improve cognitive diversity? His own refusal to expose himself to diverse thinking leads me to suspect not. I should say that Rathi attended a Transparency Task Force online symposium on the 16th of September 2021 entitled The FCA's Transformation Programme and Beyond. TTF kindly gave me a speaking slot, which I used to present a brief summary, I've linked to it in the notes, of the points I've been trying to make to the organisation since 2014 about governance, transparency, accountability, culture, people and proactivity. Sadly, Rathi and his colleagues left the call shortly after his Q&A session, so he didn't actually see it. I should mention that 2 CEOs, eventually and reluctantly, agreed to me meeting with their direct reports. The first of these, spring 2015, cancelled 2 pre-arranged appointments. The second one, I was already on my way to the office. Throughout most of the presentation, he rocked on his chair, feet on a desk, sometimes picking his nose. The intended message of his body language was clear. I took it that he really did not want to be in the meeting, that he resented my presence, and that he was trying to bully me by presenting an unwelcoming facade. He observed that the FCA was doing just fine as it was, and there was no scope for improvement. and even parroted the FCA public affairs line used extensively in early briefings with MPs, that those who invested in the fund had been greedy and naive. In the footnotes, I've explained that given the fund promised a similar annual return to more liquid investments, such as a FTSE all-share tracker, I consider the greed allegation unfounded. Likewise, the naivety claim is unfair for two reasons. First, it's an important principle that consumers should be allowed to rely on financial promotions approved and in this case also issued by authorised firms. And second, it is a consequence of the fund's usage status that it could only be issued to sophisticated, professional and high net worth investors. While these may have their own vulnerabilities, in the round they are intelligent and financially and legally literate. Among those I've met who invested in the Connaught Fund are several QCs, one of the UK's top insolvency lawyers, a past president of the Law Society, a former Big Four audit partner, a retired chief financial officer of a FTSE 100 company, the chair of a listed property firm, successful entrepreneurs from sectors such as hospitality, property development and recruitment, and a BAFTA award-winning TV producer stroke director. They are not easily dismissed as fools. That the FCA should gaslight and scapegoat these individuals while trying to persuade politicians and the victims that an entire office full of statutory regulators, many of them lawyers and all of them with extensive powers to demand evidence and even enter premises, genuinely could not spot the fraud, is in my view indicative of the toxic culture of the organisation and of the lack of scrutiny and accountability that has allowed it to survive for so long. Second meeting I had with a direct report of an FCA chief executive to discuss my proposals took place between December and 2016 and Jan 2017. There were two sessions. He was politically more astute. He claimed to take my observations seriously, but concluded that the then underway FCA mission review, do you remember that, would fix any shortcomings. He also suggested that if I wanted the FCA to change, I should apply to become the next chief executive. Clearly, I would never even get an interview, or failing that, I should put myself forward to be a member of the Financial Services Consumer Panel. He may or may not have been aware that I'd done so several times. And one year, when the initial shortlisting was contracted out to a search firm, so therefore probably done independently, I even received an interview. I was rejected on the grounds that the FCA felt I might criticise it. In the footnotes, I go on to say that actually that's the idea. According to the Financial Services Act 2012, the FCA is required to consider representations made by the panel and to publish responses to them. So Parliament intended it to be a comply or explain regime. Sadly, it doesn't seem to operate that way, with the FCA choosing the members, many of whom have obvious industry connections, and a few of whom have obvious track records, and very few of whom have obvious track records as consumer advocates, and using it as, at best, a sounding board, rather than giving it free rein to drive the regulatory agenda from a consumer perspective. I learned some years ago that the FCA commissioned an internal review into what went wrong in its regulation of the fund from its Regulatory and Compliance Oversight Team, known as RCO, in June 2015. It was delivered in Feb 2016. I've made a number of Freedom of Information Act requests to see this document, all of which were initially declined on the basis that the FCA requires a safe space for discussion. The validity of this argument weakens with the passing of time, and in my view expired when the Parker Review into the same events, which I believe he based loosely on the RCO report, was published in December 2020. Eventually, the Information Commissioner's Office overruled the FCA and ordered it to disclose the new document, the document to me. At first, it provided me instead with a redacted version of a PowerPoint summary of the lessons learned that was presented to its board. I had to ask the ICO to challenge this egregious breach of its ruling. It again ordered the FCA to disclose the requested document. This turned up just a few days before I submitted this testimony, but only up to a point. The FCA had redacted it to remove some of the most contentious passages. It argued, and I've linked to its justification on grounds doing so, it had a right to do so, citing two sections of the Freedom of Information Act. And the first is section 44, which says it can't disclose information where prohibited from doing so by law. The relevant law being the Financial Services and Markets Act, known as FSMA, specifically section 348, which I've linked to. The problem with this is that FSMA says section 348 applies only to information supplied to the regulator, not created in-house, and for which permission to disclose is not forthcoming from the party who provided it or to which it relates. I suspect that some of the redacted information was created in-house and know for certain that permission was not sought from the relevant parties before refusing to disclose it. Section 31, it has discretion to withhold information if disclosure could impair or prejudice its law enforcement activities. The flaw to this argument is that the FCA's own enforcement director, Mark Stewart, told me, and I've linked to an email proving this, in 2021, that its investigations were complete and there would be no further actions. I wonder what uncomfortable truths might be contained within that the FCA doesn't want me to see. As you would expect, I will continue to press the matter with the ICO, seeking to obtain a version of the report with the sensitive passages unredacted. It's my view that there's an overriding public interest in the full disclosure of that document. As I'm sure listeners are aware, when the Parker and Gloucester reports were published, the FCA committed to a transformation project aimed at remedying the shortcomings identified, which were very similar. Weren't these actually the same problems identified in the RCO report almost half a decade earlier? If they were, why were changes not made back then? And if they weren't, why was that report in 2015-16 a whitewash? We need to know why the process of remedying the organisational flaws to allow the fund to come into existence to fail and the parties involved to get away with it. Of course, there have been no prosecutions, fines or bans, and Stewart informs me there will be none. Why it did not begin until December 2020, if indeed it started then at all. I have my doubts. See my answer to question 20. Instead of in Feb 2016 or earlier. Had such measures been taken sooner, many other scams, not least LCF, in which taxpayers face a £120 million bill and investors are left nursing similar losses, could be prevented. In footnotes, I won't do it in depth here, I explain why it is true to say that LCF investors themselves are bearing at least as great a loss as the £120 million partial compensation they've been given to by the Treasury. Incidentally, at one point, the FCA became convinced that I'd received a copy of the RCO report from an internal whistleblower. Its response, which echoes its behaviour when I identified the conflict of interest represented by Wadham's supervisor tutor, was to threaten to prosecute me. It seems to me unlikely that the receipt of a digital copy or a photocopy using the employee's own printer and paper of such a report would involve the commission of a criminal offence. And even if a technical offence had allegedly taken place, the public interest surely overrides such considerations. And let us say, purely hypothetically of course, that I have had sight of a draft, perhaps not the final version, of that report. And let's say it identifies many of the same problems as the Parker and Gloucester reports do. If that's the case, it would surely mean that the FCA board chose not to act on credible internal warnings of serious problems for almost half a decade. That would be a very grave matter indeed, especially given the number of frauds and other instances of consumer detriment that could have been prevented had it chosen to act. It might also explain why the FCA became so aggressive when it suspected I had a copy, and why even now it's desperately resisting my Freedom of Information request for the final version of the report, which I can then disclose to politicians. Finally, I'd like to recount my interactions, specifically my attempts to meet with Charles Randall and Andrew Bailey, and to have a rant about both. Having been refused meetings with successive FCA chief executives, I decided to try for an appointment with the recently appointed chair, Charles Randall. My plan was to attend the FCA's 2018 annual public meeting. Back then they happened physically, not online, sit at or near the front, then when proceedings ended, approach Randall as soon as he left the stage. My thinking being that, with journalists within earshot, he would agree to meet with me. The good news is that this ploy worked precisely. He introduced me to his PA, Ian Runacres, who provided his card and undertook to set something up. The bad news is that the position changed when I emailed Runacres to arrange it. It seems that the offer was not made in good faith. Now, a rant. I accept that Randall, or his successor as chair of the FCA, is a busy and important individual, and that I'm a nobody. In the normal course of events, I would not expect him to see me, and I would understand that he has many more important calls on his time. But in the specific circumstances in which we find ourselves, I'm not a nobody. My role leading an action group in a liquidators committee for complex investment fraud, in which there has been at minimum extensive regulatory failure, makes me a very important stakeholder. The FCA's leadership team should engage with me and many others like me in similar positions in a spirit of gratitude and humility, anxious to apologise, help us and learn from us. Until the FCA gets this, in my view, it's doomed to keep repeating the same inevitable mistakes. If I were in a position of authority over the FCA, I would dismiss Randall for this matter alone. Luckily, he's going anyway. The arrogance and unaccountability that underpin his refusal to engage are, in my view, profoundly unrepresentative of the dysfunctional culture that prevails at the FCA, especially in relation to consumer interests. And the presence of such thinking at the very top of the organisation is an obvious barrier to change. His public binning would have acted as a public signal to the FCA staff that the world is changing, that past behaviours will no longer be deemed acceptable. Next, Andrew Bailey. Following the publication of the FCA's announcement, which I've linked to, of the Parker Review, I contacted Bailey to raise a number of concerns about the choice of reviewer, the terms of reference and the protocols under which he would operate. I should add that I've been in previous extensive correspondence with Charles Randall, who chaired the board subcommittee that oversaw the report about these matters, trying to get some stakeholder input. Instead of agreeing to work with us on an open and transparent process, the FCA announced all three parameters a fait accompli, without any involvement from any chosen stakeholders. His chosen reviewer, Raj Parker, had been a colleague of two members of the FCA senior leadership team when they, like he, worked at Magic Circle City law firm Freshfields. First was General Counsel Sean Martin, and the second, Chief Operating Officer Nausicaa Delphas. Both were intimately involved in the events he was required to review. And had he not agreed to the FCA's request to redact their names, or the names of accountable executives, I believe both would have found their positions untenable. These concerns, along with my fears that the review would not lead to any meaningful reform, formed the basis of a subsequent complaint, which I've linked to. I requested a meeting with Bailey, in part to establish whether some input could retrospectively be engineered into the specification and oversight of review for the fund's liquidators and liquidators committee, but also to discuss why he was trying to achieve a partial whitewash and establish whether a solution could be found that might work for all parties. For instance, if he feared that a rigorous review might identify evidence of a cover-up, which might lead to prosecutions for misconduct in public office, we might be able to agree to terms of reference that excluded such considerations in return for an undertaking that financial redress would be paid to the victims and a commitment to a package of reforms without the need for an admission or public proof of wrongdoing. It was my understanding that the meeting would be a one-to-one and that it would be conducted on a without prejudice basis. Unusually, Bailey eventually agreed to meet, perhaps conscious of the complaint. When I arrived, I found Bailey flanked by two colleagues, his private secretary, Toby Hall, a barrister, and an unnamed note-taker, who I later learned worked in Mark Stewart's private office. Bailey said the meeting was on the record and not without prejudice. Three interesting things emerged from the interaction. First, on the issue of redress, when I challenged him for repeating the FCA's November 2017 statement, which I've referenced earlier, that CFM's redress package had put investors in the position they would have been in had they not invested in the funds, he accepted it was inaccurate and he agreed not to make the claim again. In short, he acknowledged that there were still unremedied losses to be dealt with. Two, when I floated the idea of the FCA compensating victims, either without admission of liability on the basis of negligence rather than misconduct, he said, well, as far as I'm concerned, we've done nothing wrong. If the review finds otherwise, we'll reconsider. This is significant for two reasons. A, the denial of failings is at odds with the commissioning and rumoured contents of the RCO report that I've referenced earlier. In fact, now I've seen even the redacted version, I know it admits extensive failings. Given that it was presented to the FCA board in Feb 2016, less than 5 months before Bailey assumed office, it's implausible that he would have been unaware of it and its contents. B, the Parker's report, despite its many shortcomings, did find that the FCA had done a lot wrong. It found that the regulation of fund and related entities was, and I quote, neither appropriate nor effective. Yet when the report was published, the FCA pivoted from its denial of causation to its current preposterous position, namely the pretense that there are no unremedied losses to be made good. 3, he rejected entirely the idea that the FCA implementing any of the changes I've been advocating, either on its own or with my input, again reiterating, and I quote, at this stage we don't believe we've done anything wrong. Given the existence of the RCO report and the need to commission the Parker one, he must surely have known this was untrue. His refusal to set in train desperately needed reforms delayed the process of fixing the FCA, if indeed it's even started now, putting yet more consumers at risk of financial harm. I accept that organisations are comprised of people and that people make mistakes. I can forgive honest errors, provided once identified, they result in contrition, offers of redress, and zeal for reform. Bailey's conduct and demeanour at my one and only meeting with him was both defensive, almost to the point of paranoia. He was accompanied by a lawyer. A lackey took minutes. He quickly became flustered and aggressive. It contained no hint of contrition and was dominated by point-blank refusal to acknowledge the need for redress or change, despite him having to admit, when the facts were against him, that the fund's investors remained substantially out of pocket. The internal publication of what I understand to have been a damning RCO report and the unprecedented commissioning of not one but 3 independent reviews into alleged regulatory failure, the Parker, Gloucester and Swift ones. It was abundantly clear to me, not least from the forced error on the 2017 redress statement, that Bailey was rattled, that he had no satisfactory answers, and that he was simply trotted out an agreed position, most likely that of the Treasury. So, time for a bit more of a rant. I see Bailey as a bloviating PR man whose term as chief executive of the FCA will be judged by history as a colossal missed opportunity to fix a profoundly broken organisation. His so-called mission review, which he presented at the outset to the Treasury Committee and other stakeholders as a transformational project, did not amount to a hill of beans. I challenge any reader of my response to this call for evidence to list 3 meaningful improvements to financial services regulation that happened as a result of it. Despite being well trained to handle public speaking in events where questions are easily anticipated and answers heavily rehearsed, Bailey's composure fell apart in our close contact meeting, and I realised what I was dealing with is little more than a malevolent Forrest Gump, a city patsy holding back long overdue reform while glad-handing gullible politicians and selling them a convincing story. The FCA, under Bailey's leadership, not only failed to prevent more and more egregious misconduct cases than have occurred under any previous CEO. The footnote says that the FCA itself admits that the sum lost annually to investment frauds has tripled since 2018. But it's also been a major causative factor in the biggest for a generation, namely Woodford. Anyone who doubts the extent of the regulator's complicity in that case should read Built on a Lie, Owen Walker's excellent account of the case. He actually misses some of the regulatory failures in this case, but picks up more than enough of them for it to be impossible for any impartial reader not to reach the conclusion that Andrew Bailey is profoundly unsuited to performing a leadership role in any major organisation, let alone the central bank of the world's 5th largest economy. Incidentally, I predict that if the FCA somehow survives the fallout from this call for evidence, it will be brought down by the truth about Woodford. The failings were almost as extensive as in the Connaught case, but the number of investors and the quantum of loss were an order of magnitude greater. And crucially, the story demonstrates the FCA's boneheaded resistance to learning from past mistakes. Bailey knew the FCA was unfit for purpose when he became its CEO. He called it broken in a session with the Treasury Committee, yet he plainly did not fix it. It matters not whether he's incompetent, wrongly believing he'd resolved the many problems, or dishonest, telling politicians he'd sorted the flaws while knowing he hadn't. There's no way someone incompetent or dishonest should be governor of the Bank of England. I believe politicians should remove him from that post to protect the UK from systemic risk and the BOE from reputational harm, and to send a powerful message to Nick O'Reilly and to those who come after him. If you don't fix the FCA, you shouldn't expect to have much of a reputation or indeed a career afterwards. Now, you may think I have a personal grudge against Bailey. You'd be right, in the sense that I consider him personally to be unfit for public office. But you'd be wrong to assume that this view is uniquely personal to me. There are a great many misconduct victims, whistleblowers and campaigners whose assessment of him is at least as negative as mine. And such views are also held by those with no axe to grind, including the independent financial advisor Al Rush, who tried to help the victims of the British Steel pension scheme, the members of which, whose savings were wrongfully transferred out of the defined benefit scheme on the advice of dodgy IFAs. His account, which I've linked to, of Bailey repeatedly nodding off in a crucial meeting about the scandal should, in my view, shame anybody who would set out to defend the leadership's culture of the regulator, or indeed Bailey's continuing tenure at the Bank of England. When I first read it, I thought perhaps we should make allowances. Maybe Bailey had to get up very early to make a meeting in South Wales. But no, actually the meeting took place in the FCA's London head office. So it was the victims and those helping them who'd had the 5-hour journey, and Bailey who was on home turf. So there was no excuse. I believe it shames us as a nation that Bailey was able to fail upward from his period of reluctant leadership at the FCA into the job he's wanted all his adult life, that of Governor of the Bank of England. And it scares me that such a dubious individual is the head of our central bank. It also leads me to question the integrity of the Court of the Bank of England, the Treasury, and those members of the Treasury Committee who are close enough to the facts to be aware of Bailey's shortcomings in nodding through the appointment of such an obviously unsuitable candidate just before the Parker and Gloucester reports were published and as the Woodford implosion reached its zenith. There can be no doubt that plenty of people with the authority to stop Bailey's elevation knew what he was and is, yet they let him have the job. Why?
Thank you, Mark. We're going on to question number 7 now. How well or badly do you think the FCA has performed in your case?
Well, I hope everything I've written in this response so far indicates that I believe the FSA and FCA have acted appallingly, whether that's in failing to perform the most basic functions of authorisation and supervision to prevent £100 million Ponzi fraud, in responding to repeated incredible alerts pointing to consumer detriment, and in investigating, enforcing, obtaining redress and applying learning based on its past failings. I've hinted a couple of times so far that I think some aspects of the regulator's handling of the fund and its aftermath cross the moral boundary between innocent incompetence and willful cover-up and inaction. I stress that I have no proof of it, but I do believe that I have reasonable grounds for suspicion. It's my view that it's unfair to make such insinuations without taking the time to explain the reasoning behind them. So I will do so here. And again, with a view to fairness, I must also point out that the Parker Review says, paragraph 18, that it found no evidence of wrongdoing by the regulator, and I quote, "I should make clear that as part of this review, I have found no evidence of complicity, bad faith, willful misconduct, or dishonesty on the part of any individual working at the regulator. I have found no evidence of any conspiracy or cover-up or any deliberate misbriefings of interested parties or inappropriate collusion with other regulators." Perhaps. The irony is that my suspicion that there was a cover-up is actually based on his report. While I accept that he found no smoking gun in the sense of, for example, internal whistleblower testimony or an email proving collusion, I don't think he was ever going to find the same, given that the review was set up in such a way that all evidence was supplied to him through an FCA email address by the FCA, and he was expected to make all requests for interviews with employees present in the past through that regulator. Rather, what he did discover was a lengthy series of decision points at which the FSA/FCA faced a binary choice between doing nothing and using its statutory powers. In every instance, it chose the former option, to do nothing. If we could create the world's most perfectly incompetent regulator, but not a dishonest one, it would make every decision on the toss of coin, totally uninfluenced by evidence or by law. In the long run, just as we should expect a fair coin to land heads up half the time, so a genuinely incompetent but not dishonest regulator will decide to use its statutory powers at 50% of the decision points at which it has the opportunity to do so. A run of 2, 3, or even 4 or 5 coin tosses that land tails up, or decision points at which a regulator chooses an action, could be chance, but 20, 30, or 40, no. And the FSA and FCA have turned down more than 40 opportunities to exercise their statutory powers in consumers' interests during the fund's life, nearly 4 years, and in the first 3 years thereafter that are also covered by the Parker Review, let alone in the 7 years since the end of the period covered reviewed by Parker, during which the FCA has continued to do its best and it can to keep a lid on the case. That doesn't happen by chance. It's mathematically not credible to claim otherwise. I'm prepared to accept that the initial errors and omissions were wholly innocent. I can believe that the decision to authorise Toyota, despite the controlling entity's history as a tax fraudster, and the choice not to prosecute Nigel Walter, the founder of CAM, for his leading role in UK land investments, were consequences of the not just light touch regulation, but minimal regulation culture that the FSA was created to deliver, and that prevailed before and in no small part caused the global financial crisis. But I simply can't accept that subsequent events were equally innocent. Anyone who doubts this should read the entirety of the Parker report using the link I gave in my response to question 4 with this observation in mind, and ask themselves at every juncture whether it's actually possible to staff a regulatory body with enough stupid people for literally nobody to have spotted the need to act. It's not possible. A cynic might wonder what motive the FSA or FCA might have for not doing the right thing. Again, I stress I have no evidence or even proof, but since I set this hair running, I feel it's my duty to offer up 3 credible theories. 1, collegiate corporate culture. The FCA prides itself on an inclusive, collegiate, no-blame culture, which sounds wonderful until you think of it from a consumer perspective. If a colleague, and by the way, it's verboten to refer to those who work at the FCA as staff or employees, screws up, the culture requires those around them not to judge or blame or treat it, at most and without embarrassing that colleague, as a learning exercise. You can see where I'm coming from here. At the level of the individual, the department or the organisation, those around the problem area circle the wagons. It's a small step from this to putting external critics off the scent and to covering up. 2, the myth of Twin Peaks regulation. Prior to the global financial crisis, the FSA was an omni-regulator responsible for both prudential and conduct regulation of all authorised persons, meaning firms and individuals, in the UK. After the GFC, politicians, rightly in my view, took the view that such a structure presents risks of conflicts of interest emerging, because the prudential side is disinclined to take measures that could create systemic risk, such as eliminating bad actor firms from certain sectors, especially those that are systemically important, or reducing firms' profits through fines, restitution orders, or measures designed to improve competition. And because the conduct team may be reluctant to take action against firms or individuals for actions that have been overlooked or even endorsed by colleagues in other areas, such as authorisation or supervision. It is often said that the FSA was replaced with Twin Peaks regulation when the FCA and Prudential Regulatory Authority, the PRA, were created by the Financial Services Act 2012 and became operational in 2013. That claim is partially true in respect of the 1,500 systemically important firms, mostly the banks and big insurers, because the PRA supervises their financial stability. But it's untrue of the vast majority of authorised persons in the UK, for whom the FCA continues to be the only regulator responsible for both the systemic stuff and the conduct. Is it possible that its enforcement team, both before and after the 2013 change, felt constrained in its ability to investigate parties involved with the fund and impose a restitution order on CFM because it was compromised by the actions and inactions of colleagues in other departments, supervision and authorisations especially, who may have endorsed and perhaps even encouraged the actions of CFM in 2009, or even those in authorisations who allowed Toyota onto the FSA register when it was so clearly unfit for admission? And could it be that they were reluctant to remove CFM's permissions because doing so would have presented them with a systemic risk in terms of both listed equities and collective investment schemes because of the dominant position of CFM in the provision of services to those sectors? The third is, potential scenario explaining why this happened, the third is the GFC aftermath. Immediately after the late 2008 nadir of the GFC, politicians from all political parties identified lax, conflicted and non-existent regulation as causative factors and began calling for the abolition of the FSA. Employees risked being released into the softest jobs market for a generation. Moreover, and I stress this is speculation, at this stage I have no proof, it may be that the establishment, meaning here the banks, the Treasury and the Bank of England, realised that EU state aid rules prohibited it from rescuing the 2 big banks that were terminally insolvent, HBOS and RBS, in which case it may have embarked on a process of covert rescue, encompassing measures such as the RBS rights issue, the HBOS Lloyds merger, and a package of questionable measures aimed at rebuilding balance sheets, from the manipulation of LIBOR and forex markets to the extraction of money and assets from small businesses through interest rate hedging product sales and RBS GRG Lloyds Business Support Unit insolvency actions, respectively. These measures would have been made very much riskier for those involved had a genuinely independent, competent and proactive conduct regulator been created. But were made very much less challenging by the continuance of the ineffectual FSA, rebranded as the FCA, denuded of the prudential regulation of big firms, as the conduct regulator for those entities and the omni-regulator for the rest of the industry. Hence, the hypothesis goes, the last thing the establishment needed between 2009 and 2012, while the FSA was lobbying to be allowed to rebrand as the FCA and continue with those functions, was the emergence of a scandal in which it had so obviously failed in the performance of the roles it wanted to continue to perform. Put bluntly, the FSA could not credibly tell politicians that it was capable, rebranded as the FCA, of supervising non-systemically important firms and overseeing the conduct of the entire industry, while simultaneously admitting that a colossal error in its supervision and conduct regulation had just crystallised in respect to the fund. It may have desperately needed to kick the can down the road until what became the Financial Services Act 2012 could pass into statute, and it achieved that with days to spare. I stress that the above paragraph is merely a series of hypotheses. I make no claims for their veracity, and whether you consider them right or wrong should have no bearing on the openness of your mind to the factual aspects of my testimony. Respectfully, it's not for me to determine what motivations might underpin any decisions by the FSA/FCA leadership not to act to prevent or remedy what happened with the fund. It isn't even my job to prove that this is what happened, merely to provide some basis for my assertion that there are reasonable grounds for suspecting that this is what occurred. And I believe I've done so, using the basic truism that a genuinely incompetent regulator would make the right call 50% of the time. But this one has never done so once in the entire Connaught saga. There are some final recovery processes still underway through the fund's liquidators. Once those are dealt with, it's my intention to ask the police to investigate the regulator's handling of the matters referred to in this document. While I'm no lawyer, my research leads me to believe that the criminal offence of misconduct in public office is committed when an officer of a public body willfully neglects to perform his or her duties to such a degree as to amount to an abuse of the public's trust in the office holder without reasonable excuse or justification. When I consider the consistent failure to act in respect of what happened with the fund, whether to stop investors' monies being taken, to seek restitution, or to remove bad actors through prosecution and other measures, I'm absolutely certain that there is a case to be investigated, and I'm wholly determined that this should happen.
Thank you, Mark. On to question number 8. What do you believe the FCA could have done better once they were aware that there was a problem with the fund?
I hope my answers to previous questions 6 and 7 go a long way towards answering this one. As an overall observation, I would add one point. I believe the regulator should take ownership of problems instead of running away from them. When the fund fails, the FSA should proactively have taken charge of communicating with investors, securing monies, appointing non-conflicted insolvency practitioners, and immediately begun the process of investigating what happened with a view to identifying options for recovery, including use of restitution order. It should not have taken years of bullying and blackmail from us to get it to lift a reluctant finger, a tactic of passive resistance that continues even today. Looking at the fund in isolation, it's possible to speculate that it didn't do this because the fund's collapse was not an unexpected event or one in which it had clean hands. The FSA had many years of red flags pointing to that outcome, and it had been liaising closely with Toyota since Portalis issued his Principle 11 disclosure in Jan 2011. What I've heard from my counterparts in other action groups over the years is little, if any, better. Perhaps those two are cases in which the regulator is a participant and not just an innocent bystander. Another area in which I suspect that the regulator could have served us better is by doing no harm, and more specifically by not obstructing a police investigation. Very early on, the action group decided to notify the police of our concerns about criminality in relation to the fund. First, we went to the City of London Police on the basis that the epicentre of any criminal activity may have been Toyota, a firm located on its patch. After some reflection, the COLP decided it could not investigate. We understand, but cannot prove, that it sought guidance from the FSA about whether or not it should investigate under the Memorandum of Understanding, MOU for short, between the two. At the time, the FSA even had seconded an employee into that police service to determine which cases should be pursued, and if yes, by which party. We then took the case to the Metropolitan Police on the basis that we believed there were obvious grounds to suspect that offences were committed by CAM and CFM, both of them located outside the city but elsewhere in the capital. It decided not to pursue the matter. We wonder, but cannot prove, whether it did so on the advice of the FSA, having contacted the regulator under the terms of the MOU between them. What we do know is that the officer we reported the matter to, Paul Watmore, and I've linked to his LinkedIn profile, was shortly thereafter seconded to and subsequently became employed by the FCA. While this could of course be a coincidence rather than the payoff, the optics aren't great. And a colleague who attended a meeting with the Met team said they used an argument we've seen the regulator use many times on politicians, namely, Connaught investors were naive and greedy. What are the odds of the same line to take being dreamt up by the coppers independently and not as a result of being steered away from the case by self-serving regulators? I recently learned that the specific officer of the Metropolitan Police who closed the file on Connaught was Watmore, literally the same officer. While I can't prove that this was in any way influenced by the offer of a secondment that turned into a job with the FCA, it really is not a good look.
Question number 9, Mark. What would you say about the FCA's effectiveness and timeliness in taking action to protect consumers?
Again, I've covered much of this in previous answers. However, I'd like to look at it from another angle and make the observation that the seeds of the next regulatory failure case are often planted in the embers of the previous one. In providing the FSA with the minutes of the September 2009 meeting between CFM and CAM in October 2012, I believe that I handed it the smoking gun it needed to launch a swift and aggressive enforcement action that should have resulted in CFM or its parent Capita providing full redress to the victims, and that firm either being transformed beyond all recognition under new senior managers, the old ones having received lifetime bans, or the firm losing its permissions and hence exiting the industry. Instead, the firm was allowed to get away with paying partial voluntary redress 6 years later, £57 million paid across in October 2018, with no action against any of the individuals or the firm itself. This meant that CFM remained in the marketplace despite arch crew Connaught. This regulatory laxity meant that CFM was able to win the mandate from Woodford Investment Management, I'll call it WIM, to be the authorised corporate director, ACD, of its new flagship Woodford Equity Income Fund, WEIF, in 2014. WIM's leadership team insists, and I've linked to a testimony, that the FCA rejected proposals by the firm to use 3 smaller ACDs. There are widespread concerns about whether CFM satisfactorily performed its fiduciary duties in relation to Woodford Equity Income Fund. I have provided links to evidence to this effect. The FCA is now investigating these matters, although there are suspicions that the investigation is at best dilatory and may be artificially prolonged. The Woodford case raises a further potential conflict of interest, which refers back to my answers to question 6. One member of the CET team that received intelligence from me and others in the first 3 years following the fund's suspension and held itself out to be investigating what happened but never actually did so was a guy called Chris Martin. I've linked to his LinkedIn profile. He subsequently surfaced as compliance manager at WIM. Of the 7.5 billion people on this planet, given his history, he would know more about the shortcomings of CFM than all but at most a couple of dozen of them. Why would a former regulator take up a senior compliance role with Woodford, knowing what he did? Incidentally, I identified concerns with Woodford's flagship equity income fund in 2016 or before and started making comments below blog posts on the fund manager's website, identifying conflicts of interest and other potential problems. As a result, I was invited to visit the firm in Feb 2017 and offered to help them resolve the difficulties. While that offer was rejected, frankly, I believe they strung me along. My interactions with them and the documents I produced all constitute evidence that could be very helpful to the FCA. When the fund was suspended and an investigation announced, I emailed Mark Stewart offering to give testimony and to provide my emails and other documents to those investigating. Despite repeating this offer subsequently, I have never been contacted. I cannot help but wonder whether the regulator is genuinely investigating and whether it may deliberately be extending the time frame of its supposed investigation in order to delay the inevitable review of its own role in this spectacular fund collapse.
On to question number 10 now, please, Mark. How helpful has the FCA been to you and others affected in securing redress from the alleged guilty parties and in prosecuting or banning them so they can't do it again?
On redress, it's done too little too late, very reluctantly, and when staring down the barrels of a metaphorical gun. Why was a restitution order not sought, and why not in 2012 or before? Why only a voluntary partial redress scheme negotiated in late 2017 and fulfilled a year later? On prosecuting and banning, it's done absolutely nothing. Every single perpetrator and enabler is still out there and at liberty to do it again. And the Capita guys, of course, CFM is now rebranded Link, have done just that, resulting in Woodford customers losing billions of pounds and being deprived of access to the savings for years. I find all this grossly unacceptable.
Question number 11, Mark. What are your thoughts on whether the FCA lacks the powers that it needs, or conversely, that it doesn't make good use of the powers that it already has?
Do you know, if I could wave a magic wand and turn the FCA into a highly capable, proactive, honest, transparent and accountable regulator, there are some additional and improved powers I would ideally like it to have. However, right now, I would be vehemently opposed to it being granted them. There are three reasons for this. First, it is not using or is underusing many of the powers it has. Over the years, I've submitted many Freedom of Information Act requests and received some shocking information about, for example, the numbers of prosecutions for misleading financial promotions, none in the past 6 years, or fraud, most years either none or one, or the frequency of issuance of restitution orders following breaches of the FCA's principles for business, just 2 in the past 6 years, only one of which was ever paid. I believe it should use the existing powers to the full before being granted any more. And in the footnotes, I explained some of the powers that the FCA has in respect of conduct they could have used and they didn't use. 2, until changes are made to the governance, accountability and transparency of the FCA and to its culture, there are also risks that it might misuse any new powers. 3, the FCA's default response to criticism from politicians is to claim it lacks the necessary powers, or that there is a lack of clarity about the regulations, in particular in relation to the definition of the regulatory perimeter. I believe what is needed is not piecemeal changes in response to FCA special pleading, but rather an open and transparent discussion between politicians and genuine consumer representatives about what powers the FCA really needs and about what the environment is in which it should be operating. Powers should not be given in response to FCA pleading, where the pleading is the FCA's excuses for its own inactions.
We're on to question number 12 now, Mark. In general terms, how would you describe what it's been like dealing with the FCA?
Actually, hugely frustrating. I found dealing with the FCA many times more traumatic than being defrauded. To the extent, in fact, if I could have my time again, knowing what I do now about the regulator, both its culture stroke performance and the degree to which it's built layers of protection around itself, I would almost certainly write off my losses and walk away. I've touched on culture and performance issues in some of the earlier questions, and I'll return to them in later ones, but I'll use this one to deal with the issue of the FCA's defences, because it's actually these that make dealing with the organisation so soul-destroyingly slow and painful. Rightly or wrongly, I believe the latter, when parliamentarians created the FSA and then the FCA, they deemed that the regulators should be exempt from civil liability. I've linked to the legislation, except for 2 very limited carve-outs: bad faith, essentially criminality such as misconduct in public office, and human rights breaches, most likely the right to the quiet enjoyment of one's possessions. So far as I'm aware, neither of these carve-outs has resulted in successful litigation. It is therefore very difficult, perhaps impossible, to sue the FCA to secure compensation for losses sustained as a result of regulatory failure. I believe the time is long overdue for that exemption to be reversed and for the Limitation Act to be waived so justice can be provided for the many legacy cases that have occurred under the current FISMA onward regulatory regime. Aware of the regulator's broad exemption from civil liability, Parliament instead required there to be a complaint scheme, I've linked to it, that would provide a conduit through which the FCA and other financial regulators would be empowered to pay compensation to those who submitted valid complaints about their actions and inactions. It also required an investigator, in quotes, to be appointed to whom people could appeal and have their complaints independently investigated if the FCA refused to pay up. I've already spoken and written about 2 complaints I've submitted, and there's a separate question on the topic later, so I won't dwell on my specific experiences here. Instead, I'll make some general points. Unfortunately, Parliament entrusted the regulators, principally the FCA, with writing the rules of the scheme, and to appoint the Complaints Commissioner. The appointee cannot therefore be deemed to be independent of them. For 4 years, 2016 to 20, the then Complaints Commissioner Anthony Townsend criticised the regulators for setting rules for the scheme that in practice prevented him from recommending compensation in cases of regulatory failure or anything larger than de minimis sums, irrespective of causation. The regulator's response was to launch an accelerated consultation, I've launched to link to it, last year into proposed changes to the complaint scheme that would actually codify and formalise these problems rather than remedy them. Transparency Task Force's response, to which I contributed, can be found at a link in my own testimony. Recently, a new commissioner was appointed. She is a controversial choice, both because of her colourful backstory, I've linked to a story in the Daily Mail, which might reasonably be expected to constrain her ability to return to a career in the legal profession or secure an equivalent role elsewhere in the public or private sector, and hence may mean she's more reliant on her current appointment than is healthy, potentially limiting her ability to speak up or challenge wrongdoing, and because she is held to have been insufficiently critical of the Financial Ombudsman Service, known as the FOS, in her previous role of independent assessor during a period when the FOS was exposed as failing by an addition of dispatches. The problems identified were covered up rather than remedied, ultimately resulting in the accumulation of such a huge backlog of complaints that the Chief Executive had to resign. As things stand, the rules of the Complaints Commission mean that it can't be used as a route for consumers, including investors in the fund, to recover from the FCA the shortfall between the recoveries by the regulator and the sums they've lost. The regulators have twice extended the date by which they expect to publish consultation responses and new rules. This happened in part because the Complaints Commissioner has criticised the FCA's position. I've linked the criticism expressed initially to LCF investors seeking redress from the FCA for the shortfall between the compensation provided by the Treasury scheme and the totality of the losses, that the complaint scheme should not be a route to redress where regulatory failure is not the sole or principal cause of loss. Now, I've said in the footnotes, given that regulatory failure leads to loss only when it enables misconduct and mistreatment, realistically, it can never be the sole or principal cause of loss, but is always the or a enabling factor. The FCA has rejected, and I've linked to the reason for doing so, this finding, and consumer organisations are considering whether a judicial review might be possible. The costs of pursuing such potential remedies are high, and there's a huge inequality of resource. Sadly, the FCA leadership has no qualms about spending large amounts of levy payers' money, the intended purpose of which include consumer protection, to deprive consumers of valuable rights. The best outcome for those who invested in the fund would be the regulators backing down and turning the complaint scheme into a genuine route for the payment of redress in regulatory failure cases as Parliament intended. If that happens, I'm confident that Connaught victims will be compensated, whether by the FCA accepting the game's up and paying us, the Complaints Commissioner overruling it, or us taking the matter to judicial review. The next best would be the FCA being compelled to make the complaint scheme compliant with the law as a result of a JR. The worst outcome would be having to decide whether to commence expensive litigation with uncertain prospects of success on bad faith grounds more than a decade after the fund was suspended. I would appreciate it hugely if parliamentarians reading my evidence or watching it would write to the FCA urging it to take the first of these paths. The feeling that the FCA has rigged the rules in its favour is echoed in fields other than the issue of redress for regulatory failure. I've discovered that at any one time, the private secretariat of the Economic Secretary to the Treasury contains either one or two seconded FCA employees. While I can't prove that any of those individuals have failed to pass on correspondence that I've sent the various holders of that post over the years, or passed it on to their employer instead, I cannot be sure that this has not happened. What I do know, which concerns me greatly, is that one former holder of the ministerial office has told a mutual friend that they would have made a different public statement about the fund than they did had they been more honestly briefed on the issue. During the past 9.5 years or so, I have had, or tried to have, because they're largely insulated from the public by the staff, FCA secondees amongst them, dealings with almost every economic secretary of the Treasury. My take on the office is that many of those who have been appointed to it in recent years genuinely wanted to do a good job, came into the role assuming that the FCA is a good actor, meaning broadly competent and honest, and discovered that the truth is more complex, after which they were swiftly moved on. I suspect, however, that the current incumbent, John Glenn, is an unfortunate outlier. It worries me that he sees himself as a cheerleader for the city and he is willfully ignoring compelling evidence of misconduct by the industry and the regulator alike. I believe it will be difficult, if not impossible, to remedy the long-standing problems that exist in the sector while he remains in post. I know that the Treasury Committee has at times had a seconded FCA employee on its secretariat. Again, I cannot prove that this has impaired the transmission of correspondence from me or other regulatory failure victims to the committee's members or resulted in the regulator being tipped off, but I also can't rule it out. I do know that I wrote to the committee in December 2020, urging it to launch an inquiry into the regulation of conduct, similar to the one it conducted for London Capital and Finance, and that I've since provided additional evidence for the need for such an inquiry, but the issue has not even been discussed by the committee. I can't be sure whether this is the result of intervention by the FCA secondee or a political decision by the committee chair. I also know that the FCA is not above misleading, or at least giving misleading impressions to select committees. That's a pretty bold claim, actually, and it's right that I should have to justify it. So for now, I'll just concentrate on two episodes. For the first, I refer you to an email, I've linked to it in my testimony, originally sent to Mel Stride, the Treasury Committee Chair, and subsequently forwarded to Stephen Timms, Work and Pensions Committee, which shows how Mark Stewart provided diametrically opposed explanations to the two committees to justify the paucity of prosecutions of financial services fraudsters. For the second, please read my email, again linked to in my testimony, to Mel Stride following Megan Butler's evidence session before the Treasury Committee about her role in the London Capital and Finance scandal and the appropriateness or otherwise of her elevation to the role of Executive Director for Transformation at the FCA. While I accept that none of her comments was, so far as I'm aware, an outright lie, I do believe that she created a materially misleading impression when answering a number of the questions. Finally, for this section on politics, I'm aware of an excellent researcher employed by a hugely supportive Member of Parliament who was approached by the FCA's public affairs team about a potential move to the regulator on a massively increased salary. They were told that their role would be to, and I quote, "tell us what MPs are being told about us before they get to know about it," close quote. The obvious implication being that the job would entail this individual persuading other MPs' staffers to persuade tip-offs to the FCA about inbound casework crucial to the regulator while either delaying or preventing it reaching the politicians. These problems, unfortunately, also extend to the FCA's governance. Over the years, I've made multiple attempts to interest chairs of the Financial Services Consumer Panel and those of the non-executive directors of the FSA and FCA supposedly appointed to represent consumer interests in the Connaught case. Their standard response is that they cannot take up individual cases. My response is that the fund affects 2,000 people, not just me, and that it throws up issues impacting more widely on the competence and integrity of the regulator. Sadly, to no avail. And of course, there's only one nominally consumer panel, but there are 3 industry ones set up under statute, and the 4th one created informally by the FCA. So even there is an inequality of arms. In short, I've learned the hard way that it's all but impossible for people who suffer as a result of the FCA's many shortcomings to achieve financial redress, whether through litigation or the complaint scheme, despite politicians intending otherwise. It's also exceptionally difficult to achieve traction with senior politicians because messages are filtered through FCA secondees, or the FCA's senior team have privileged access and provide a version of events that is at times at best disputed, and at worst misleading, or to harness the support of those who are supposed to hold the regulator to account from a consumer perspective.
On to question number 13, Mark. What is your perception of the culture of the FCA and what do you think about it?
Okay, where to start? Probably by trying to be fair to individual FCA employees, many, perhaps even most of whom, do not deserve what follows. The FCA is an organisation of some 4,500 people, assuming it's fully staffed. At the time of writing, the FCA is in the midst of a self-inflicted staffing crisis, with some departments suffering up to 50% vacancy rates. Many of the individuals in the organisation are extremely capable, many passionately want to help consumers, and some meet both of these criteria. but they are operating within a very specific cultural environment, led by people who followed very particular career paths and who are subject to very obvious financial incentives. Last year, I watched the entirety of Dominic Cummings' evidence to 2 select committees. He described much of the UK's pandemic response as, quote, lions led by donkeys. This led me to reflect on how I'd describe the FCA were I in a similar position to him. Are the top brass donkeys, i.e. stupid but fundamentally harmless? In my view, no. I've already accused them of being high-functioning sociopaths, arguing that most are relatively intelligent but determined to apply their skills to playing fast and loose with the facts and regulations to provide cover for not performing their statutory duties. What are the ranks? Are they lions? Certainly some are. Those who step forward to provide testimony to this call for evidence strike me as such. But sadly, I think they're the outliers. I don't detect a surfeit of bravery amongst those I've dealt with over Connaught. Quite the reverse, I describe them as depressingly complacent. Worse, some have struck me as unbelievably naive, over-educated fools, lacking in street smarts, who couldn't spot a fraud or tell when they're being strung along to save their own lives. Judging by their outputs, I therefore describe the FCA as containing a critical mass of useful idiots led by high-functioning sociopaths. I must say, after I wrote this description, I've said this in the notes and the footnotes, I considered deleting these descriptions, not because I think they're unfair, because I think that there are some individuals for whom it's desperately inaccurate, but because I'm conscious that the FCA might exploit my choice of words to make out that my response, or even the entire exercise, is offensive or vindictive. It does have form on this. You should probably have a look, and there's a link in my footnote, to Andrew Bailey's comments about the 2016 New City Agenda report into the culture of the regulators, which I've also linked to. Bailey picked up on a single quotation from one respondent who claimed that when the FCA was abolished, and here's a quote, all good people want to be in the PRA, all the Dobbins went to the FCA, close quote. I believe that the APPG call for evidence, to which I'm now responding, would have been unnecessary had the FCA's response to the NCA report half a decade ago been to accept the need for reform instead of feigning offence at the message delivered. Let's hope Nikhil Rathi reacts more constructively this time round. Many of the criticisms are in fact very similar, including the observation that the majority of FCA staff may not be optimally intellectually equipped for the task at hand. If you consider the claim unreasonable, consider this. In September 2021, after the damning Connaught and LCF independent reviews, it was reported, I've linked to this, that 56% of FCA staff admitted they didn't understand why the FCA needed to transform. While some of this may be the fault of the leadership team watering down the message delivered to it by external stakeholders, the ignorance does point to a disturbing lack of situational awareness among FCA employees. So, of course, this description of FCA staff as useful idiots led by functioning sociopaths is not relevant to all of them. You know, I'm stressing that there are some brave and capable souls within the organisation to whom neither label belongs. Any plan for fixing or replacing the regulator should consider how their skills and motivations can be utilised, as currently they're being underused. I should also stress that I'm not accusing the majority or even the many of the FCA's staff of being idiots in the sense of being cognitively subnormal. Rather, judging by their outputs, which in my view are often defective, I'm arguing that many of them are useful idiots in the sense that their work, which is mostly undertaken in good faith and executed to a reasonable standard, is being used to create the appearance of effective regulation without the inconvenient actuality, and that they've been naive in being hoodwinked into believing that their work is genuinely important and useful. It's perfectly possible for intelligent people to produce defective outcomes if they're in an environment that discourages or deters them from using their capabilities effectively, or if they operate within a system prone to groupthink or other cultural biases that lead to inept thinking or flawed or no action. If you dispute my assertion, which you may, that it's impossible to be a useful idiot without being an idiot, consider a tweet which I've embedded into my evidence sent by the FCA's careers team to promote its graduate training programme. The tweet reads as follows: there aren't many jobs in which you have the opportunity to question CEOs of banks at the age of 22, exclamation mark, Sean, graduate. Now, Sean is almost certainly not an idiot. He's a recent graduate. He's competed to get onto the FCA's graduate training programme. On FCA form, he is probably from a Russell Group university, quite possibly from a law course. So it's likely that his IQ places him within the top decile of the UK population. So he's not an idiot, but he is a useful idiot in the sense that he plainly lacks the life experience and domain knowledge to present an effective challenge to the chief executive of a bank. So his role in such sessions represents the appearance of scrutiny without the inconvenient actuality. He is sufficiently naive that he doesn't realise that he is being misused in this way. It's possible that the manager who rationalised that sending a recent graduate to perform this task is also a useful idiot, who rationalises sending Sean into unequal battle by telling himself or herself it's good to develop trainees' capabilities by giving them significant early experience. In her or his defence, I believe that he or she is operating within a culture that places undue value on academic achievement and too little on life experience and economic incentives. But what of those at the top, those who engineer the organisational culture and the operating procedures to deliver these outcomes? I've called them high-functioning sociopaths, and there is nothing in this illustration of organisational behaviour that leads me to feel uncomfortable about using that description. There is, in my view, zero possibility of fixing the FCA without a radical purge of these people. To make matters worse, the FCA circles the wagons at the first hint of criticism, in my view, because protecting the organisation enables it to continue to protect, as those at the top perceive it, the organisation's ability to defend the city. It is in effect a firewall between the public and the financial services industry, but one designed to protect the powerful from the weak, not the reverse. The FCA's defensiveness means that anyone who challenges the complacency, groupthink and opacity is either frozen out if internal or briefed against if outside, the perfect recipe for ensuring there is never meaningful change. One of the most depressing aspects of my involvement in this call for evidence, I'm on the Secretariat of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fair Financial Services and have been intimately associated with the exercise, has been interacting with decent, hard-working and motivated FCA employees who've given moving testimony about how colleagues or they themselves have been treated by management when they've challenged the organisational line on a particular issue. Some are bullied, overlooked for promotion, denied bonuses or pay rises. Others are made to sit away from their team, ostracised, or even made redundant. And as evidence of my allegation, the FCA seeks aggressively to shut down those who seek to criticise it, I offer this example. I'm aware of a manager at the FCA who came under extreme pressure from somebody much further up the organisation to remove from their team a colleague who had played a small part in an episode that resulted in the surfacing of legitimate and constructive information that proved to be embarrassing for the regulator. To the manager's huge credit, they resisted successfully. When the APPG's call for evidence was announced, I asked them whether they would consider responding to the exercise and mentioning being placed under pressure. Their reply was, and I quote, "No way, I might want to keep working." Elsewhere in this report, I've talked about how this dynamic feeds through to organisational behaviour, the naivety when it comes to spotting wrongdoing, the reluctance to act, the instinct to deny, delay, deflect and defend. There is also, I think, a particular irony that the FCA prides itself on being a diverse and inclusive employer, while also being one of the least diverse and least inclusive organisations I've ever dealt with. This dichotomy arises as a result of a diametrically opposed understanding of what constitutes diversity and inclusion. For the FCA, it's about demographic factors, principally protected ones, and even then, only some of those. For me, it's about path dependency and economic incentives. Put bluntly, if the FCA hires a bunch of young law graduates and puts them in an office in London, it doesn't matter if half are female, half LBGT+, some are BAME, they'll still think like a bunch of young law graduates in a London office. And if many of them have ambitions to rotate into jobs in the financial services industry or in the professional services firms that feed off it, there must be a risk they'll act like a group of people who want to ingratiate themselves with those prospective employers. Genuine cognitive diversity would entail hiring more non-graduates, people who've had successful careers unrelated to the sector, in particular, those who've demonstrated the drive and ability to investigate and expose vested interests, such as detectives working on extremely high-value complex cases, investigative journalists, intelligence officers, and yes, people who've led action groups representing the victims of financial services misconduct and regulatory failure. Since 2014, I've been trying to persuade the FCA to do these things, so far without success. To provide just one illustration of the extent to which the FCA really does not get the basics of diversity, consider this Freedom of Information request disclosure I've linked to. The FCA's own recently appointed senior advisor on the public sector equality duty is a long-standing insider tapped up for the job with no external candidates sought or considered for the position. How very diverse of them. Incidentally, I think there is something even more fishy about this appointment than the fact it was handed to one of the FCA's own without a competitive process. A Freedom of Information request by another campaigner revealed, and I've linked to this, that there isn't even a job description. The beneficiary of this extraordinarily laissez-faire appointment, Georgina Philippou, achieved unintended fame, and I've linked to an article in 2019, when her internal memo about the toilet habits of colleagues went viral. Could it be that Nikhil Rathi created a responsibility-free non-job and gave it to Philippou as a way of managing her out of her previous role as Chief Operating Officer without the hassle of a capability-based disciplinary procedure? If so, what does that tell us about how money is spent at the FCA and also the economic incentives brought to bear on those working there, especially at and near the top? This episode reinforces my view that the FCA has a performance problem because it has a people problem, has a people problem because it has a leadership deficit, has a leadership deficit because it lacks appropriate accountability. And you may think, well, that was not an isolated case, surely there aren't others like it. Well, no, actually. Here's another one. The role of a policy manager, consumer policy and partnerships, which is currently being advertised. This position involves consulting with the FCA's self-selected group of consumer organisations, I should say Transparency Task Force is asked to join and been refused, on policy consultations. The successful candidate must, and I emphasise the word must, and I quote, be able to draft communications in line with the FCA tone, a very specific way of doing things, a tone of voice that exists only within the FCA, and should, doesn't have to be must, this is preferable. So of course, if no candidates apply, we've got this, fine. But if any candidates apply, have got it, and some who haven't, the ones who have got it are going to get the job. So the person should have experience in, and I quote, developing and implementing changes to the FCA policy framework. Now, how the hell does anybody develop and implement changes to the FCA policy framework unless they work in the FCA, and specifically in policy areas in the FCA? It's impossible. Can I break into their computer system and go and change their policies overnight? No, I can't. Do you think it's possible, therefore, that they may have in mind giving the job to an FCA insider, as opposed to a dangerous free thinker from a consumer organisation? If so, why might they be so anxious to give this role to somebody who they can be sure will communicate in line with the FCA tone and develop and implement the FCA's policy framework, and not, for instance, policies advocated by the consumer groups supposedly being consulted? Certainly, whether intentional or not, the signal to consumer advocates is pretty clear. Don't bother applying, you're not wanted here. Rather than riff further on the FCA's people problem here, I thought it best to link to a document, it's in the text, which is the Transparency Task Force's response to the regulator's recent consultation on diversity and inclusion. Notably, the regulators did not ask respondents to comment on how they, the regulators, are performing against these diversity criteria, but rather on how the industry is doing. We decided to ignore this admission and provide a frank assessment, see our response, to question 2. It provides multiple examples of what we see as the FCA's dysfunctional corporate culture, including insider and crony hires, lack of educational and class-based diversity, underrepresentation of certain protected but low priority demographic groups, particularly people who get older, London-centric worldview, political and cultural biases, misunderstanding organisational objectives, too close to the industry, too distant from consumers and whistleblowers, the revolving door, culture of secondments, insufficient staff turnover, bonuses for failure. Please do read it. It's an interesting read.
Mark, thank you. On to question number 14, Mark. What do you think about the possibility of conflict of interest issues at the FCA?
I hope I've already identified a number of examples in this document, some specific to my experiences with the fund, but illustrative of wider organisational flaws, and others that are generic, not related to the fund at all. These include FCA personnel able to supervise and even investigate firms in which key positions are held by former colleagues and friends. In the footnote, I've said, I should add that in addition to the Wadhams conflict in the Connaught case, I learnt just last year that a member of the FSA team called in to look at Toyota after Patelis Principle 11 disclosures was a close friend of one of the directors of Toyota. Patelis provided evidence of this to Parker, but Parker chose to exclude it from his review. I wonder why. Second, the inherent tensions involved in being an omni-regulator, which the FCA is for all non-systemically important firms. Governance structures dominated by those appointed by the FCA or the Treasury. FCA control of the complaint scheme and appointment of the Complaints Commissioner, through which the consumers ought to be able to achieve redress for regulatory failure but can't. Insider and crony hiring, and a cultural predisposition against hiring for diversity of experience and economic alignment. The economic incentives presented by the potential for revolving door appointments. To these I would add one more. It surely cannot be right that when the FCA is accused of regulatory failure so egregious to merit an independent review, the FCA is allowed to choose who conducts the independent review, the supposedly independent review. In the Connaught case, choosing somebody who's a former colleague of at least two of those whose work he was expected to evaluate. Determine what he or she is paid. Set the terms of reference and protocols under which he or she operates. Require all evidence submitted to be sent to an email address hosted by the FCA. Require the reviewer to request all meetings with current and former employees through the FCA. Award itself asymmetric Maxwellisation rights. It seems, I should say as well, it seems to me that Maxwellisation is legitimate when a person criticised by a statutory report has the right to include their defence or their version of events alongside an allegation. It's less so when they're permitted to remove that criticism, especially when other stakeholders who might have evidence that challenges the legitimacy of that person's objections is denied the opportunity to argue the case for the criticism's retention, which is what happened with the Parker report. Also, the original intent of Maxwellisation was to prevent a private individual being unfairly maligned by a statutory body where there's the potential for significant imbalance of power in favour of the latter. In granting itself, being a huge statutory body, Maxwellisation rights in relation to Parker's report, the FCA has upended this principle, turning it into a right for statutory organisation to reject criticism made of it by an individual, something never envisaged when Maxwellisation became commonplace. And finally, once the report is published, award the reviewer a cushy part-time job without advertising it, briefing out search consultants, or considering any other candidates for the position, which is what happened in respect of Raj Parker. All of these things happened in the fund's case. I've already linked to my complaint, in which all but one of these last issues is raised, and the final item is included in the insider and crony hires section of the diversity response. So these are not allegations I'm making without evidence.
Mark, on to question number 15. Have you ever complained officially about the FCA? If so, to whom? What happened and how do you feel about what happened? What feedback, if any, have you had about your complaint? How helpful was the feedback? How long has it taken for your complaint to be processed? Thank you.
I've mentioned two complaints so far in this document. The first about Randall and Bailey trying to rig the Parker review and trying to block genuine reform respectively resulted in a determination that I've linked to from the Complaints Commissioner. The FCA agreed not to provide its own decision first, given that the complaint was about its chair and CEO. The second about the FCA's misleading and false claims to the effect that investors in the fund are harbouring no unremedied losses has so far resulted in a decision letter, linked to in my testimony, from the FCA. I've appealed it to the Complaints Commissioner, who I feel confident will uphold the FCA's position. Both complaints took much longer than the complaint scheme rules would suggest to be dealt with. It seems that the rules preventing the payment of redress to consumers when there has been regulatory failure are enforced to the hilt, whereas those on the regulator and the commissioner about the timeliness of response are more honoured in the breach. In respect of my first complaint, that the FCA control the Parker review in such a way as to prevent it being a transparent exercise in establishing the truth, and the regulator had no intent of implementing anything like the scale of change needed, I believe subsequent events have vindicated my concerns. The Parker report is less than a quarter of the length of the Gloucester one into RCF, despite covering a longer time frame. He capitulated to FCA lobbying to remove the names of accountable executives, whereas Gloucester not only resisted, but named and criticised those officers for making such representations. He claimed not to find evidence of bad faith or cover-up, despite the compelling mathematical argument that it must have happened. He excluded late evidence presented by Patelis, that a member of the FSA team investigating his Principle 11 disclosures about Toyota had a close familiarity link to a director of that firm. And shamefully, once the fuss died down following the report's publication, he was given what looks very much like a thank you job by the FCA, a cushy part-time sinecure as a senior legal advisor, a role that was never advertised or briefed out to search consultants, and for which no other search consultants were no other candidates were considered. And I've linked to the Freedom of Information request showing that the FCA admits that these things are all the case. I should admit that I submitted the third complaint. I've linked to it in December 2021. This one concerns what might appear to be a small matter, but it actually isn't. The FCA refused to trial a small change I suggested it try making to its ScanSmart campaign, which alerts consumers to the risk of being subject to financial scams. I suggested that the ad should carry a prompt asking consumers who've seen a scam to notify the FCA. It's my view that this would have a number of advantages, including providing a powerful deterrent to prospective scammers, because they would see the risk of detention as much raised. It would provide the FCA with much earlier intelligence about specific scams, and it would raise the possibility that scammed consumers might be able to secure redress from the FCA by providing an audit trail of evidence that the regulator was tipped off about the scam very early on, but refused or failed to take action to protect them. The FCA initially tried to reject the main part of this complaint on the grounds that I was complaining about general satisfaction as opposed to a specific policy decision. Obviously, this argument is invalid, so I successfully challenged the decision. At the time of writing, the long overdue final response is awaited. Meanwhile, a few days after I submitted the complaint, the FCA blew £41,000 on a spoof Christmas jingle, more than £2 per play, and many times what it could have cost the regulator to trial a single transformative change to its ongoing creative, the effect of which I still believe would have been to transform the effectiveness of its multi-million pound campaign. The idea that the FCA should reject a constructive suggestion from an engaged and informed campaigner might have helped to protect other consumers, and even attempt to reject my complaint about its decision to do so strikes me as illustrative of the complacent and unaccountable nature of this regulator. More widely, I think there are a number of ways in which the complaint scheme falls short of the obligations which I've linked to placed on the regulators by Parliament. These include they're required to appoint an investigator, whereas the Commissioner is empowered only to conduct a paper-based review, which does not extend to interviewing any of the parties or a search for or of primary evidence, which means in my review that he or she isn't really an investigator, but rather at best a reviewer. Also, the regulator sees and can challenge the entirety of the complainant's complaint and evidence, whereas the complainant is never afforded a symmetrical opportunity to see and challenge evidence put forward by the regulator, the respondent. Prospective complainants are required to complain to the regulator within a year of becoming aware of the matter in question. Complaints may be brought only by those directly affected by the matter complained of, or acting directly on behalf of someone who is. So whistleblowers, among other motivated and relevant stakeholders, are largely disenfranchised. In addition, the scheme rules correctly reflect the act in that the Complaints Commissioner is empowered to appoint somebody to conduct part or all of the report, provided such a person is independent of the regulator, but the current Commissioner refused to make such appointment when I challenged her basic lack of understanding, whether innocent or willful, of the means by which the economic loss suffered by Connaught investors might be calculated.
On to question number 16, Mark. Overall, what have been the consequences to you, and if relevant to your family, as a result of what's happened?
The financial cost is many millions of pounds. the emotional cost is incalculable. Low points have included the suicide of Alistair Maudsley. I've linked to media coverage, someone who was on the periphery of the fraud. He emailed a great many people, me among them, blaming me for the decision he made to end his life. Having to sell a much loved holiday home to provide liquidity so I could continue the fight. The death from cancer of one investor in the fund who persistently begged me to get the matter resolved before he died because he didn't want his daughter, a single parent with a disabled child, to have to deal with it once he'd gone. I was unable to deliver for him. The more recent death from cancer of Charles Rodborn, a fellow member of the Liquidators Committee and Action Group, activist as well, who had been a particularly positive, engaging and supportive ally, and who was an exceptionally decent and principled man. The matter really should have been resolved long before his passing. Everything I do now in relation to the fund is in his memory. On a personal level, the pain caused to me by the FCA arises from a combination of anger at its failure to prevent, stop and remedy what happened in the fund, its refusal to fess up and pay up when banged to rights, and perhaps worst of all, its shameless playing fast and loose with the truth to dodge the day of reckoning in which it's either abolished or made subject to radical, externally opposed and verified reform. In recent years, I've done a lot of work to help other victims in regulatory failure cases, and by far the most upsetting aspect of that work is the fact that I knew their cases were going to happen, in the sense that I was fully aware of the problems with the regulator that makes misconduct so easy to perpetrate and so unlikely to be detected, stopped or remedied. But I've been unable to persuade the FCA or politicians to do anything to change the state of affairs so others don't have to suffer as I have done. This is a failure for which I blame myself. Similarly, I've worked with many good whistleblowers from the sector and seen how their evidence was ignored or downplayed by the FCA, and they were hung out to dry in much the same way as happened to George Patelis. I've had to live with the fact that I've been trying and failing to get the regulator to fix these behaviours since 2014, 8 years ago now. This is not merely a historical problem. I know for certain right now, today, that there are many other more cases arising now that will happen in the months and years to come, because we are still as a country refusing to confront the bleeding obvious truth that the FCA is spectacularly unfit for purpose and must be either binned and replaced or reformed beyond recognition. This might actually be an appropriate time to deal substantially with the point first raised under question 3 and hinted at elsewhere. Currently, it's pretty much impossible for the millions of people who've lost money through regulatory failure by the FCA to obtain compensation for their losses. Given that this call for evidence exists to inform parliamentarians, I'd like to take this opportunity to ask them to revise the legislation so we do at least have one, and ideally more than one, way to secure such redress. Under FSMA, Financial Services Markets Act 2000, both the FCA and its employees are exempt from civil liability. I've linked to this, with narrow and, to the best of my knowledge, untested carve-outs for acts of bad faith and breaches of the Human Rights Act. I should say in the footnotes, there are many difficulties in bringing a claim based on the HRA that are too complex to cover here. I'm happy to discuss them with any parliamentarians who may be interested. For present, I will simply observe that, to the best of my knowledge, no claim has ever succeeded. I'm not even sure if any have been brought. Mindful of this, parliamentarians legislated for creation of the complaint scheme, most recently in the Financial Services Act 2012, imposing no constraints on the grounds for which compensation might be recommended or paid, or to the quantum of such awards. Unfortunately, they entrusted the regulators to create the scheme rules and appoint the Complaints Commissioner. The subsequent consequences are scheme rules, and I've linked to them, that in practice bar the payment of compensation where regulatory failure is the or a underlying cause of loss, and the payment of anything more than de minimis sums for inconvenience or distress rather than economic loss. There are 5 reasons why I believe that it is essential that legislation is needed to give citizens viable paths to the payment of financial redress for the full economic losses sustained as a result of regulatory failure, both through the courts and the complaint scheme. In other words, they should have 2 routes for doing this. First, currently, those losses are borne by individual consumers who have the narrowest shoulders. Making the FCA compensate them would relieve them of this burden and pass it to a stakeholder group with deeper pockets, namely the financial services industry, through the mandatory levy that funds the FCA. Second, among consumers, Those who bear the heaviest burden, those who sacrifice their livelihood or retirement to lead the process of investigating what happened and campaigning for redress or reform. As I've argued elsewhere, society derives huge benefit from their activities, and it is vital that their investment of time is repaid generously should it be found that competent, honest regulation could have prevented the misconduct that they've had to unpick. Failure to do so acts as a deterrent to others performing the same role in similar cases. Indeed, and I've said in the footnotes, I've spoken with victims of financial services misconduct resulting from regulatory failure who have declined the opportunity to put together and lead action groups for precisely this reason. As I have myself indicated, if I could have my time again, I would not have done what I did for Connaught victims. 3, the consequence will initially be a substantially higher FCA levy. Let's be honest, it'll cost them a substantial drag on industry profits. Actually, this is to be welcomed in that firms which normally benefit from complacent or captured regulation will for the first time be forced to bear the negative externalities of that state of affairs. And this will cause them to pivot from being broadly accepting or even welcoming of the status quo to alignment with consumer and whistleblower representatives in calling for a much improved regulatory performance and accountability regime. In other words, you hit them in the pockets and they will become advocates for better regulation, just as we are. 4th, politicians and other interested stakeholders will, for the first time, benefit from a robust and transparent indicator of the effectiveness of the FCA, namely the annual bill for compensating regulatory failure victims. Unable to shield itself from such claims by citing legislation or using the complaint scheme, the FCA would come under huge pressure to minimise these losses by becoming a rigorous, proactive and effective regulator. That's surely a desirable goal. 5th, rolling back the FSMA exemptions would open the door to regulatory failure victims suing officers and employees of the FCA individually. Now, while the FCA staff handbook, which I've linked to, indicates paragraph 1.12 that the regulator indemnifies employees against certain claims brought against them in relation to acts and omissions occurring in the course of their work, there's a carve out for bad faith. It may be that some campaigners would seek to use that to bankrupt bad actors within the regulator. If so, there would be one hell of a salutary effect on their colleagues and successors. Finally, I'll just say this. One of the 2 key things I hope parliamentarians reading my response to the call for evidence will act on, it's this: creating genuine routes for those harmed by the FCA to obtain redress from it would transform the organisation's accountability and transparency, would align economic interests behind genuine transformation to ensure that both the regulator and its officers would be at risk of adverse consequences if they fail to perform their statutory objectives to a reasonable standard. And in the interests of equity and social justice, it's important that the Limitation Act is waived so those of us harmed before any legislative change are not time barred from pursuing our claims.
Question number 17, Mark. If you could change 3 things about the FCA, what would they be?
I think there are 2 viable overall plans to remedy the FCA. I'm going to call them Plan A and Plan B. One has 3 points to it. I think the other might have 4. Plan A is as follows. Step 1, create a truth or royal commission. I apologise. What I mean is to create a truth and reconciliation commission or a royal commission in which consumers, regulators and the industry can speak freely about what's gone wrong in UK financial services regulation since the FCA came into being, an improved version of the one that took place in Australia, which I've linked to. Focus should be on providing financial redress to the victims, removing the perpetrators and enablers from the industry and its regulator, and identifying the optimum structure and powers for any future regulators. So this is a really consensual process. Step 2, abolish the FCA. Step 3, create a new regulator, or perhaps two of them. Prudential regulation of non-systemically important firms would either go to the PRA or to a new body. Conduct regulation across the board would move to a new conduct regulator. They would have very much improved governance, transparency, accountability, and legal liability arrangements with different powers, and would be barred from employing former senior managers and employees of the FCA in order to distinguish its toxic organisational culture and institutional memory. Plan B would look like this. Step 1, introduce an oversight board that would ensure that consumer interests were always at the forefront of the FCA's activities, similar to the one introduced in Australia, which I've linked to, but with a wider remit as is appropriate to the greater importance and complexity of the UK's financial services sector and to the more extensive regulatory problems here. Transparency Task Force has already developed a proposal for a Financial Regulators Supervisory Council, FRSC. I've linked to this proposal, to which I've contributed and which I wholeheartedly support. It fixes many of the FCA's governance problems and provides a path to clearing out the top team without scaring too many horses. 2, put in new leadership chosen by the FRSC and hence aligned with consumer rather than producer interests. This should encompass as a minimum binning the current board and executive committee. It's only by cutting off the head of the organisation that you stand any chance of eliminating the profound conflicts of interest that currently exist, destroying organisational memory and sufficiently disorienting those remaining to be confident that what follows will not become an echo of what has existed hitherto. 3, introduce a genuine duty of care to be owed by authorised persons, which means both firms and individuals on the FCA register, to consumers. The FCA has recently consulted, I've given you a link to it, on what it terms a new consumer duty in response to a legal obligation placed on it by the Financial Services Act 2021, again I've provided the link, to consult on whether there should be a duty of care and to bring forth rules in accordance with the findings of the consultation. I believe that the supposed new consumer duty is not a duty of care unless accompanied by a private right of action, meaning a right of consumers to sue if they lose money as a result of breach, something the FCA is steadfastly resisting. And that the initial consultation document by the FCA, which I've linked to, misdirected respondents about the legal definition of a duty of care. I'm concerned that the FCA is again positioning itself as a captured pro-industry regulator, trying to avoid the imposition on the industry of a duty of care and the empowerment of consumers who, under a genuine duty of care or the consumer duty combined with a private right of action, would gain the right to sue financial services firms that harmed them instead of being dependent on the FCA to obtain redress by means of restitution order or negotiated settlement, both of which are very rare occurrences. Transparency Task Force has submitted responses to both the initial and subsequent consultations. I've linked to them in my evidence. I was lead author on both and strongly endorse their content. 4, establish a historic claims panel under the aegis of the FRSC to examine and recommend redress for the many victims of historic regulatory failure and capture in UK financial services, combined with a backstop of removing the FCA's broad exemption from civil liability, both retrospectively and going forward, and waiving its right to decline historic cases under the Limitation Act. So those who've lost money through legacy regulatory failure claims can litigate if they're unable to get redress from the historic claims panel, or if their claims arise after the panel has been wound up, its work completed. As you can see, these are 2 quite different approaches. One is a year 0 approach, abolish the regulator, and another is very evolutionary. On balance, I prefer the latter. There are 2 reasons for that. First is it's a marginally easier, or realistically less difficult, sell. And second, on balance, I actually think it's more likely to deliver a solution that works. The biggest risk to Plan A is that binning and replacing a financial services regulator is something that happens at most every 12 to 15 years, and achieving it would entail a long fight, followed by a further extended period of consultation, legislation and implementation. There's a risk we might eventually win the battle but lose the war. The FCA might be replaced by something almost as bad or perhaps even worse. After all, there are lessons in what happened in 2012/13. Responsibility for prudent regulation of systemically important firms was hived off to the PRA, but otherwise the FSA largely continued unchanged as the FCA, mostly the same people doing mostly the same things in the same building with a different sign above the door and with the same history of regulatory and failure and cover-up that nobody wants to run up to because it's too expensive. Small wonder it remained subject to the same cultural biases, conflicts of interest, economic incentives and governance flaws, and even a smaller wonder that it delivers similarly complacent and conflicted regulation. For clarity, I don't believe that Plan B on its own would make much difference, because the same cultural problems, which in turn are about people and leadership, would remain. But crucially, Plan B represents the absolute minimal set of changes that are needed to create the governance and incentives environment in which those problems can finally be resolved. And I have no doubt that the culture created by these defective circumstances is at the heart of why it persistently fails. Indeed, both Dame Elizabeth Gloucester and I said so when giving evidence, I've linked to it, to the committee charged with examining the Compensation London Capital and Finance PLC and Full Compensation Fund bill recently. That bill created a £120 million liability for taxpayers. I would hope as part of this we could also learn from this experience. These are both, whether you go for A or B, and they're grand plan. They are huge projects aimed at delivering fit-for-purpose financial regulation in the UK. I accept that both are multi-year exercises requiring extensive political buy-in and legislation. In the meantime, I think some good work could be done with the cooperation of the current FCA leadership team to make the organisation much more transparent and therefore a little bit more accountable. I've mentioned at several points in my testimony that the FCA ruthlessly gains its compliance with requests for disclosures and data subject access requests under the Freedom of Information Act. Politically sensitive requests are delayed, refused on dubious grounds, or extensively, and in my view, often unnecessarily redacted. Meanwhile, it covertly tracks and logs the activities of individual campaigners, me among them, consumer groups such as Transparency Task Force, and we know from DSR's data subject access requests that senior managers close to the CEO even email others forewarning them about the content of our Twitter feeds and even our online meetings. Obviously, I'm not saying they're spying on us. These are public meetings that we put on Twitter, on YouTube, and then tweet about. But the fact is that somebody being paid by the regulator sits there for a couple of hours watching a TTF symposium and then telling his mates what was in it. How can that be appropriate? I think it would be productive for politicians to ask, or perhaps instruct the FCA to sign up to a transparency agenda, comprising pledges such as: don't monitor campaigners' social media or event activity. Comply with all DSARs and FOI requests within the statutory deadlines. Appoint an independent data reviewer acceptable to campaign groups, not one of your own patches, whose role it would be to consider and approve any proposed redactions and refusals to comply with requests. Publish all FOI disclosures on its website as soon as possible after disclosure. At the time of writing, and I've linked to this, nothing has been published since May 2021. Publish all consultation responses except the tiny number whose authors elect to refuse permission. This is important because currently stakeholders have to take it on trust that the FCA accurately reflects the balance of opinions expressed in the responses received, because we are denied the opportunity to see and learn from others' inputs or to force into the open the positions lobbied for by industry participants. Publish a register of interests for every member of its industry and consumer panels to include a disclosure of industry and financial interests of both, complaints/regulatory sanctions for the former, and for the latter, history of consumer advocacy. And I've mentioned before, there are suspicions that many people on the consumer panel are not genuine consumer representatives, and those of us who are rejected out of hand for membership.
Question number 18, Mark. What positives are there about the FCA that you'd like to comment on?
My initial reaction is, you've got to be joking. My more considered and more generous one is to say that some people who work at the FCA genuinely want to do a good job and are intellectually capable of the same, given the right training, leadership and incentives. It behoves politicians to change the rules such that the preconditions are put in place that make it possible for this potential to translate into performance.
Question number 19. Do you believe there should be spot checks by the FCA on regulated and or unregulated entities, perhaps similar to the sorts of spot checks by VAT inspectors?
I think there could be value in this idea, provided the FCA's culture and people problems were resolved, such that it employed more people who were streetwise, astute and proactive at spotting and challenging anything suspicious. Without that change, such checks are unlikely to be of much value, because one of the FCA's many cultural weaknesses is that it employs few people who could spot a fraudster if one pirouetted through its head office in a pink tutu, holding a neon sign flashing the words, "I'm a fraudster," and even fewer who actually feel empowered to challenge wrongdoing when they see evidence of it. You might consider the last comment frivolous or hyperbolic, perhaps. But consider this: Dame Elizabeth Gloucester, a sober, measured QC, told the Treasury Committee that such were the cultural problems at the FCA during the LCF era, which is relatively recent. I've seen no evidence that the claim transformation programme will change this, that even if one of the hundreds of alerts about the firm received by the FCA's call centre had been escalated into supervision, in all probability it would not have been identified as a red flag, and consequently nothing would have been done about it. Is it credible, I mean, I do ask this question, that of literally hundreds of consumer inquiries, not one of them, not one made it out of the call centre? It's a bit like that business about tossing the coin. You know, surely one of them would have made it out of the call centre. Or is it actually more likely that concerns were escalated, but in fact, as Dame Elizabeth rightly predicted, no action was taken, and that the FCA simply concealed this from Gloucester because it was easy to blame lowly call centre operatives rather than admit that supervision is structurally useless?
Question number 20. The FCA is undertaking a transformation project. Do you have any comments to make about that?
I think the best way to answer this question is to set out what I think a satisfactory transformation project would look like, and then consider to what extent the current one really that's underway currently at the FCA meets that description. So in my answer to question 17, I set out two approaches to fixing the FCA, as you know, plans A and B. Both had three common characteristics. There's a genuine recognition that the FCA has failed consumers, and that these failures have been widespread and have occurred over many years. This recognition is not merely rhetoric, it is backed up by a full financial redress package for those who have suffered loss as a result, and unambiguous civil liability going forward. Change is not merely operational. The regulator's governance, accountability, staffing and culture are also changed beyond recognition. Third, the lunatics are not in charge of the asylum or the convicts of the prison. The job of fixing the situation is taken out of the hands of those who caused the problems and handed to other stakeholders, especially consumers. In short, plans A and B effectively describe what the characteristics should be of a transformation project. They would genuinely transform financial services regulation in the UK and therefore merit the term transformation. In contrast, the project currently underway at the FCA is at best a modest operational change programme designed to placate politicians, and at worst, defensive displacement activity designed to convince politicians that the regulator genuinely learnt its lessons without actually changing anything that matters. And I suspect that of the two, the latter description is more accurate, and I've got 4 reasons for saying that. First is, Nikhil Rathi promoted Megan Butler to the newly created role of Executive Director for Transformation without, and I've provided a link to the Freedom of Information request, advertising the role externally, briefing it out to search consultants, or even considering more than one internal candidate. Butler was named in the Gloucester report as one of the executives responsible for what went wrong with LCF. Had Parker not caved into FCA representations to omit names, I believe she would have been featured prominently in his report too. I supplied this Freedom of Information request to the Treasury Committee, which quizzed Rathi and John Glenn about the appointment. I'm pleased that its report, which I've linked to into the matter, was highly critical of the appointment. Given that both Gloucester and the committee identify the FCA's culture as the principal challenge, how can it possibly be appropriate for Butler, who was literally a founder employee of the FSA? She joined in autumn of 2000, but I cannot prove this to you because subsequent to the Treasury session, she appears to have deleted her LinkedIn profile. I wonder why. So she was there from the year 2000, and she played a significant role in some of its most controversial cases. How could she be the lead change agent? I actually believe she was also, in various respects, less than transparent in her comments to the Treasury Committee, which I've mentioned in my answers to question 12. The FCA, which prides itself on diversity, should have caught should have sought a cognitively diverse candidate from outside the organisation, the industry and the professional services sector that feeds off it, and should have worked with external stakeholders, including genuine consumer representatives, to find somebody in whom we could all have confidence. It did none of those things. And then it gets better. When Butler subsequently announced her intention to leave the FCA, I've linked to the press release, Rati said the role would cease to exist as a standalone position, with the transformation brief being added to the existing duties of recently appointed Executive Director for Authorisations, Emily Shepherd. Speaking, I've provided a link to the Treasury Committee in December 2021, Randall admitted that a further 3 years of the transformation project were needed before it could said to be close to completed. So at least 3 years. Under such circumstances, why turn the role of leading it into a part-time job? And why give it to somebody whose own department was criticised for slow processing of applications and authorising firms and individuals that should be screened out in the very same Treasury Committee, and who therefore already has a very full-time job with no certainty of a successful outcome? Frankly, she may not make the grade. She may need to be transformed herself. My suspicion is that Rati is desperate to avoid hiring an outsider into the role, as he or she would expect to execute a genuine transformation and might blow the whistle if blocked from doing so. Once the Treasury Committee criticised for giving Butler the job without advertising externally, and she left, the only option still available to him was the profoundly unacceptable workaround of tacking it on to the existing responsibilities of an existing executive. Okay, so next, I believe his hard sell for the supposed transformation project at the recent webinar, and I've linked to it, to launch the FCA's 2021/2 business plan was actually a ruse. If you watch the Q&A session from 36 minutes to 40 seconds in, you'll notice that some of the questions are credited to individuals, while others are anonymised. As one of the people who watched the webinar as it went out and who submitted questions via the online platform, I can tell you there was no option given to omit one's name. So those questions that were anonymised, they didn't come from the online form. My suspicion is that the no-name questions were therefore softballs prepared in advance by the FCA's comms team. They're ruthless, but they're actually not that intelligent. Do you remember what I said about high-functioning sociopaths? Which might just be excusable if there was a shortfall in genuine questions from the audience. I can already predict that's their defence. But that's bullshit. I, for one, submitted 8 of them, and not a single one of them was used. And in the footnote, I'm not going to go through it now, I've said that this manipulation of public events does have a precedent, a particularly unfortunate one in 2019, which is the reason why actually the FCA is very grateful for COVID, because it means that probably forever now there is a precedent established that they can hold online events, which makes it very much harder for the public to call them to account. Next point, cracks are already starting to emerge at the FCA's claims about the supposed transformations being delivered by the programme. In Transparency Task Force's response, and of course I've linked to it, to the FCA's recent diversity consultation, we demonstrate that the execution of the, in quotes, in confidence, with confidence whistleblowing initiative is already failing due to unremedied and destructive groupthink near the very top of the organisation. Mark Stewart and the Executive Casework Unit that deals with correspondence for the Board and Executive Committee. The stats on what the FCA does with whistleblower evidence, hint, Sweet FA in the main, are particularly damning. If nothing is done to terminate the current displacement activity and impose genuine transformation on an obstructive FCA, I'll confidently predict that in the years to come we will look back on this exercise in exactly the same way as we now see Bailey's largely pointless and now forgotten mission review, a dead cat strategy, again I've linked to it, designed to placate gullible politicians. Sometimes, more than sometimes, I become bitter and angry at the fact that I've had to spend the last 9.5, 10 years of my life trying to unpick a wholly avoidable mess created by the FSA and attempting to prevent others suffering similarly. And worse, when I think that there are many more years of this ahead of me, a police investigation and litigation, unless the FTA caves. At other times, I see upsides to the longevity of my involvement. One is that doing this stuff for so long means I have a continuity of understanding of the regulator that has outlived the terms of office of members of the Treasury Committee and successive economic secretaries to Treasury. This has actually put me in an almost uniquely advantaged position of being able to spot and identify patterns of regulatory behaviour. The most obvious one is the one I call the public affairs change promise, When Martin Wheatley became the FCA's inaugural CEO, his position with the Treasury Committee was straightforward. The FSA is broken. I'm going to fix the situation with my wonderful new FCA. When Andrew Bailey succeeded him, his pitch to the committee was only a slight pivot. The FCA is broken. I'll fix it with my amazing mission review. And Rati, the FCA is broken. I'm going to fix it with my wonderful transformation project. If there's one message I desperately want politicians to take away from my response to call for evidence, it's this, and I'll be blunt. The lying toads at the top of the FCA have been and are lying to you. Whatever the chair and the CEO of the FCA and their GIMPs are saying publicly, they are not going to change voluntarily. Trust me, I've spent the last 8 years trying to persuade, cajole, and even bully them into changing, and they've tried every imaginable ploy to avoid doing so and to appear to comply without actually implementing material change. Either you turn a blind eye to the FCA being spectacularly unfit for purpose and let innocent members of the public continue to be mistreated by the financial services industry and the wide boys on its periphery, or you flush away the sociopaths at the top, taking the matter wholly out of the hands of those whose interests are served by the status quo, and transform the governance and accountability structures so consumers are in the driving seat. Your choice. But don't duck the decision, pretending change will somehow come without your intervention, then feign surprise a few years down the line when it turns out that things stayed exactly the same. Because I promise you they will. And real change must be accompanied by liability for regulatory failure, including a genuine means for those of us who've lost money as a result of the FCA screw-ups since the year 2000 to be compensated. Until the regulator stops trying to dump responsibility for its own screw-ups, real change is a chimera.
Question number 21, Mark. Are there any other comments that you would like to make?
Yes, in fact, what I'm going to do is to use this question to deal with matters that I think are important, but don't really fit in the answers to other questions. So the first is that people at the FCA may brief some of the politicians that I've got an agenda. I'm realistic. The FCA has a sizable and capable public affairs team, and its senior leadership devotes time and effort to the management of politicians as a stakeholder group, recognising that they possess a unique ability to determine the regulator's future. I suspect that the organisation will see this call for evidence as a threat, recognising its potential to undermine an image of the regulator that it has worked hard to create in Westminster, and perhaps being able to bypass the seconded FCA gatekeepers in the Treasury and the Treasury Committee, who might have the potential to filter the flow of information to powerful stakeholders. Indeed, in the Connaught case I wrote to the committee in December 2020, I think I mentioned, following the publication of the Parker Report, requesting that it undertake a similar inquiry to the one it did for LCF. After it declined to do so, I learned from an extremely credible source that the matter wasn't even laid before the committee for discussion before being rejected. Well, I don't know whether this was done by the Secretariat or its chair, Mel Stride, a former Treasury Minister. I do find the decision suspicious, given the huge missed opportunities to press for redress and the victims ensure learning is genuinely implemented. Given the history, and in particular the FCA's desperation to avoid being held accountable, there must be a risk they'll try and discredit the call for evidence by trying to undermine the credibility of the witnesses. In my case, they may claim I've got an agenda. They'll say I want the FCA to compensate Connaught victims and the victims of other regulatory failure cases, that my bill will be the biggest because of the time I spent on the matter, and that I want the FCA to adopt my proposals of reforming the organisation and even engage me to either oversee or implement them. Actually, all of those claims are true. So what? Why wouldn't I want the victims to be compensated, myself very much included? And what kind of campaigner would I be if I didn't have constructive proposals for reform and want to ensure that they would genuinely be put in place? For clarity, I don't seek any more compensation than the sum I've lost. And if fully compensated, I don't expect to be paid anything for any oversight role in respect of any change programme. I think the second briefing that they will attempt is to claim that I'm some kind of political extremist. So the FCA admits, and I've given a link in the text to the correspondence, that it monitors my social media activity, as well as that of Transparency Task Force, of which I'm an active member. The FCA may attempt to misrepresent some of this material to portray me as some kind of extremist, and by implication, crank whose views may be dismissed. For the avoidance of doubt, where it comes to party politics, I'm a red Tory populist. I'm a communitarian and a Leave voter. If you follow opinion polls, you know that my belief set is shared by many British voters, perhaps the majority of those outside London and the university cities, including those who don't normally vote Conservative. The woke corporatism practiced by the FCA is a niche belief set relative to mine. Please don't be taken it. They may also say I'm a conspiracy theorist. So in responding to this call for evidence, I've tried very hard to signal clearly where I'm making assertions of fact, where I'm expressing opinions, and where I'm floating hypotheses. The FCA might alight upon one or two of the hypotheses and claim I'm some kind of tinfoil hat merchant making unsubstantiated allegations. If so, this is grossly unfair. You can choose to believe or reject a hypothesis. It doesn't undermine the validity of the facts contained in this document, nor does it warrant rejection of my opinions, which I believe are mostly or wholly the logical corollaries of the facts that I've presented. If any reader of this document wants to question the accuracy of any statement in this document that I present as fact, but is not fully substantiated within it, they are welcome to contact me and I will endeavour to do so. I would also readily accept an opportunity to give evidence to the APPG on personal banking and financial services in person, or to any parliamentary committee about the matters contained in my response, knowing that it's a criminal offence to mislead Parliament. And I will say exactly the same things to those committees, if necessary under oath, as I've said in this evidence. Likewise, I will gladly sign an affidavit confirming that the statements I've represented as fact in my evidence are, to the best of my knowledge, all true. I'm aware of other campaigners who've submitted data subject access requests, DSARs, to the FCA in order to see information held about them. Often compliance with such requests takes many times longer than the statutory timescale, and documents are withheld or rejected, perhaps unnecessarily so. But there have been some worrying instances, which may be referred to in the testimony of others in this call for evidence, of documents emerging which indicate that the FCA has been monitoring their social activity, media activity too, tipping off, in some cases, authorised firms about complaints or correspondence they've sent to the regulator, referring to comments they've made at Transparency Task Force events, which implies that the FCA monitors campaigning activities, or otherwise acting in ways that many would consider unethical, improper, or even illegal. The Freedom of Information Act response that I've linked to in my testimony confirms the FCA does indeed monitor the activities of Transparency Task Force, even tracks and records the history of what they were, while another email from the executive casework team confirms that the FCA conducts covert monitoring of my Twitter account and that of TTF. Setting aside the fact that this activity almost certainly breaches privacy rules, how can this possibly be an acceptable use of monies raised from the industry and ultimately from consumers to fund the execution of a set of statutory duties? I've put these questions to the FCA, and at the time of writing, you'll see in the link what I've asked them, at the time of writing, the response is awaited. I wouldn't hold your breath, but certainly this is not a matter I'll let rest. So I'm not a conspiracy theorist, they really do have to for me. So the next one is he's got it in for us. You know, maybe I should talk about that, confront it head first. It's true that an impartial reader might conclude from my response to the call for evidence that I am not the FCA's biggest fan. My use of phrases such as useful idiots led by high-functioning sociopaths, allegations of the leadership team misleading politicians and covering up misconduct, combined with claims that those they employ consistently fail to act in the face of evidence of consumer detriment, might together suggest that I question the integrity of those at the top and the capabilities of some mid-tier and lower employees. The FCA might leverage these and similar passages to suggest that I'm bitter about the regulator's shortcomings in a criminal case that I'm seeking to smear its reputation. An alternative approach might be to reflect on the possibility that my claims are warranted, especially given that they are likely to be echoed in many of the other responses to the call for evidence. A statutory regulator charged with protecting consumers, ensuring that there is effective competition and preventing market manipulation and failures, if it was doing its job well, would surely be lauded by consumers and detested by industry incumbents. The FCA, broadly speaking, provokes the opposite reactions. What should that tell politicians about the regulator? Next point, what goes for me goes for others too. It goes without saying that the 4 observations I made above are likely to apply equally to the vast majority of other respondents. I say the vast majority because I'm aware of a small majority small minority of whistleblowers and victims of financial services misconduct and regulatory failure who have suffered such emotional and financial distress or under such threats as a result of spending many years trying in vain to attract help and remedy situations that have suffered real mental harms. Occasionally, some of them can see conspiracies where there may in fact be none. So I'd ask readers of any responses that have that kind of feel about them to not reject out of hand an entire response to this call for evidence, or certainly not the whole exercise, because they see a single allegation that is self-evidently untrue, or because the person appears to be somewhat eccentric. Rather, I urge them to consider what level and duration of distress the person making it could have been exposed to, by whom, and why, that might have led them to such a mental state. And if some respondents allege that the FCA is profoundly incompetent, has deliberately not investigated their allegations, or has ignored evidence of wrongdoing, especially when made against bankers or involving cases in which there has been a legacy of regulatory failure that could be exposed by retroactive enforcement, I'd ask you to look beyond the confines of the Overton window. Perhaps, just perhaps, some at least, perhaps all of their assertions may be true. Okay, so I think I should also talk about what I'm going to call the elephant in the room. In this paper so far, I've concentrated on my personal experience of the FCA, which relates to a collective investment scheme in which it failed spectacularly to protect consumers, then covered up its own failings and lied about victims' losses. From there, I've touched on other cases in which the regulator also fell short of one of its 3 statutory duties, namely to protect consumers. I've therefore not written in great depth, or any depth, about its performance against 2 other mandatory functions, ensuring there's effective competition and working to make wholesale markets operate fairly. I hope that anybody who reads my evidence will ask themselves this question: if the FCA is not up to the job of detecting, deterring and punishing those who scam and mistreat consumers, what's the chance of them policing competition or wholesale markets? The defining feature of scams such as con artists are actually really easy to spot and to prosecute. By definition, they involve making false representations to large numbers of consumers. So there is ample evidence of fraudulent claims having been made, breaches to the financial promotions regime, and of using money raised other than as described, easily demonstrated by following the flows of capital through bank accounts and into other assets. If the FCA, more than 13 years after it was first alerted to the risk of wrongdoing with the fund, and 10 years after the money ran out, has achieved 0 prosecutions, what chance does it stand against a shadowy network of investment bankers rigging an obscure index via messages over the dark web across multiple jurisdictions? Anyone who seriously thinks the Keystone Cops are a match for that kind of thing, frankly, you're delusional. In my darker moments, I wonder if that's part of the reason the FCA has been left in charge, despite all the evidence it's so catastrophically out of its depth. It suits certain city interests to keep the high-functioning sociopaths and useful idiots in post, creating a credible illusion of regulation without the bothersome reality of material constraints on behaviour. If I'm right in this suspicion, it's only a hypothesis, getting genuine change will be a challenge, because corporatist interests in the Treasury and in politics will fight it, claiming, and in some cases perhaps even believing, they're protecting the city, but in fact just helping its bad actors and hence damaging the overall reputation and prospects of the industry. And this really brings me on to the next question. Is HM Treasury the real problem? I accept that the city's establishment faced a difficult dilemma when the global financial crisis came to a head. EU state aid rules precluded government rescuing the 2 nominally Scottish banks, RBS and HBOS, since they were catastrophically insolvent on a balance sheet and not just cash flow basis. With the scale of the former alone exceeding the UK's GDP, a catastrophic failure of either, let alone both, would have had disastrous effects for ordinary citizens. My hypothesis, and I accept it's no more than that at this stage, is that bank bosses, auditors, regulators and politicians conspired to rescue them anyway, illegal or not. Ordinary shareholders were defrauded by a fraudulent rights issue and merger. Submitters were ordered to lowball LIBOR to give a misleading impression of the market sentiment about bank survival prospects. SMEs were destroyed and assets appropriated and sold by RBS's global restructuring unit, and RBS and Lloyd's equivalent business support units. Mortgages were packaged up and sold to rent-extracting US vulture funds that then yanked up interest rates. Many markets were routinely rigged and gamed. Since then, with the short-lived exception of the well-intentioned but incapable Martin Wheatley, the chair and CEO jobs of the FCA have consistently gone to people who are members of the clique of individuals who I believe were central to these acts. How could it be otherwise? Anyone not in that club might quickly identify criminality and do something to convict the perpetrators. So I believe we have, or I suspect we have, we face a bizarre situation in which a handful of people, many of them ill-suited to regulation and almost certainly subject to not wanting to be regulators, are obliged to perform such roles, and they're doing it to protect themselves and their peers. So effectively, we've got a club of unwilling regulators kind of looking after each other. As I hinted many times in this testimony, it feels to me that the FCA is a free monkey regulator that sees, hears and speaks no ill of the banks and other incumbent city interests, and that the decision to build a culture that protects those parties means it cannot credibly adopt a different approach with smaller and less influential bad actors, such as rent-seeking asset managers and scammers on either side of the regulatory perimeter. And there's an enduring suspicion that just as the FCA protects the banks, so the Treasury protects the FCA. If this is so, then achieving genuine change requires elected politicians to deliver an unambiguous message to the Treasury that it must first abandon its corporatist ties to the city, pivoting from the rent extractors to the wealth creators and strivers who together pay the lion's share of the bills. I believe that the way in which the Treasury reacts to this call for evidence and its aftermath will provide a litmus test. It could acknowledge that good people did bad things for good reasons back in the day, and the time has come to fess up, pay up, and make the perpetrators leave the stage. If so, I think we should respond to them constructively. As I've suggested elsewhere, I think immunity from prosecution is a very fair offer if there's a willingness to right historic wrongs and hand over regulation to those who represent consumer rather than producer interests. The usual platitudes followed by the inevitable delaying and dilution tactics in response to the call for evidence being published and the results being published will tell us that the Treasury is the real obstacle to change. I hope HMT surprises on the upside, but I think we must be prepared to be disappointed. If that is the response, I think campaigners should pivot to guerrilla tactics. By this, I don't mean non-violent or even violent direct action, but rather asymmetric activities, such as crowd-funded private prosecutions of key individuals, whether in the industry or the regulators, selected to cause maximum reputational harm to the city and its institutions, and designed to encourage those targeted to switch sides and provide evidence against others and, crucially, the system. Sadly, assuming that John Glenn is still Economic Secretary of the Treasury when, as I hope happens, Parliament and the Treasury Committee debate this call for evidence and its responses, I expect him to tell them that the FCA is largely doing a good job in difficult circumstances and that RATI's transformation plan will deal with any isolated shortcomings. I could almost write the speech for him. And if the government and the city accept that the time has come to do the right thing, I suspect that he probably has to go. If any MPs or peers are reading my statement and thinking of challenging Glenn, whether in the APPG, the Treasury Committee or parliamentary debate, I offer a constructive suggestion intended to demonstrate whether I'm right in my suspicion that he knows as well as I do that the FCA is a busted flush. All you need to do is ask him this. If you, Mr. Glenn, think the FCA is basically sound and its failures few and far between, why not remove its exemption from civil liability and explicitly prevent it from relying on the time limit set out in the Limitation Act? If what you're telling us is true, few, if any, cases will succeed against the regulator, will they? Isn't that sure that's the truth? Glenn, of course, is going to bluster his way through a response not even he believes, the upshot of which is no, but the consequence of which is that whoever asks the question will know what Glenn is and whose interests he's protecting. Now, while I have concerns about the biases and motivations of the current minister, even if he were binned tomorrow, without a willingness to change that starts at the very top, I'm conscious that any successor would still be operating within the culture and structures of the Treasury. And I see that as a department at best influenced and at worst captured by city incumbents, the banks especially. Recently, George Patelis kindly shared with me the results of a data subject access request he'd submitted to HMT to obtain everything it held on him. And one of the patterns that most disturbed but at least surprised me is the extent to which there had been liaison between HMT and the FCA when ministers from the former were expected to respond to questions and debates in Parliament and correspondence from MPs about Connaught. Those same ministers had refused to meet with George and with me. On the most literal level, they chose to hear only one side of the story, that of the FCA. I previously mentioned the secondment of at least one FCA employee at any given time to the private secretariat of the Economic Secretary to Treasury, a position of influence that enables them to give the minister the regulator's view on events, to filter or to spin what he or she hears that might cause him or her to question those lines, and even to give their employer an early heads up about any incoming criticism. However could that be deemed acceptable? And John Swift, I've linked to his report on IRHPs, John Swift found that bankers, Treasury officials, and even ministers lobbied the regulator to reduce the liabilities of banks for IRHP mis-selling, really fraud. While he couldn't prove that the scheme's subsequent defects were a response to that lobbying, he found that the regulator was unable to provide any other explanation for why the sophistication tests were created. I suspect this matter will result in an investigation by the police, in private criminal prosecutions, or both. Any such process, I think, will have to widen to look at other cases as well. We know that the Treasury sought to influence the FCA over IRHP redress. Is it credible to suggest that similar pressure was not brought to bear in other cases, whether it's those affecting SMEs, such as HBOS Reading or RBS GRG, wholesale and investment banking matters, such as LIBOR or Forex, or consumer harms, including Connaught? Indeed, in the last of these cases, I've already pointed out that George Patelis' DSAR shows there was extensive liaison between HMT and the FCA to agree a common and untruthful position about him and his evidence. We must assume it was not confined to this one narrow aspect of the case. What's more, in response to a Freedom of Information request from me, the FCA has already admitted, and I've linked to this, that there are more than 2,400 items of correspondence between the organisations about Connaught. Conveniently, too many for it to disclose within the £450 labour cost ceiling provided under the Act. And as you'll see from the above link I've just given, below the FCA's email, I've made a case to the FCA for the cost limit being waived in the public interest. And I've said if they don't want to do that, I'm even willing to pay them the labour cost involved in complying with the request in full. Basically, I want to get the full disclosure of the correspondence between the Treasury and the FCA to see whether, as I suspect, there has been influence brought to bear on the regulator by the Treasury, or the Treasury has been misled by the regulator. The FCA has rejected both arguments out of hand. Again, I've provided its reason for doing so. Why might a regulator that has already been found to have been lobbied by the Treasury in John Swift's £8.6 million independent review be so reluctant to disclose documents relating to its engagements with HMT over the Connaught case if it has nothing to hide? Surely it would want me to see that nothing inappropriate happened. Setting aside the obvious public interest in disclosure, why would they not want to put people's minds at rest? The harder the FCA fights disclosure, the more strongly I suspect that some of the documents will be damning, showing that there was collusion between the two bodies to delay and then reduce any admission of regulatory shortcomings and worse, and attempts to deny the victims the financial redress they deserve. If that is the case, obviously it's a police matter. Swift has done campaigners a great service by showing that the opaque, unaccountable links we've long suspected exist between City, Treasury and FCA really are there. As things stand, the end game will be prosecutions of officials for misconduct in public office and politicians' careers ending in disgrace. Their names far too toxic for the firms they helped to be able to honour any expectations of post-politics thank you jobs. I believe those stakeholders probably know that, which is why they believe they'll have to accept the offer of an evolutionary outcome in which victims are compensated, bad actors leave the stage, and ultimate oversight of the regulators is handed to transparent, accountable consumer representatives. All they're doing at the moment is delaying the inevitable. The inevitable will happen because it's inevitable. It's either that or we build a huge new FCA branded wing at Ford Open Prison, stick them all in it. And crucially, the cost of settling rises with every year that passes as new regulatory failure cases emerge and interest racks up on legacy ones. So if the industry, Treasury and FCA accept, and I'm sure they do deep down, my premise that eventually this is going to have to be fixed, the sooner they sue for peace, the better for all concerned, them very much included. The irony is that replacing the unofficial behind the closed doors links between the Treasury, FCA and City with statutory democratic consumer-oriented accountability would actually be in the interest of the financial services industry as a whole, even if it might ruffle a few feathers in the boardrooms of the big banks. Why? Because the widespread and well-founded suspicion amongst consumers and small business owners that the industry and the scammers on the periphery will treat them badly, that the regulator won't help them, is causing many to avoid using the sector in ways that might well benefit themselves, the industry, and the wider economy. That's a classic deadweight loss for society, the financial services sector very much included. Also, regulatory complacency and capture is the reason why the European Union chose not to grant the UK financial services equivalence-based access to its markets. And I've said in a footnote, I know that this is the case because I personally provided the EU Commission, particularly the Directorate dealing with financial services, with an extensive dossier demonstrating the shortcomings of the UK's regulatory regime, particularly the FCA, asking it not to grant equivalence. Well, I don't pretend that this evidence proved decisive, and I'm sure that the EU wanted to do this for its own political reasons. I do believe that it provided the excuse that they needed to act in the way that they did. Some may question why I did it. Was it out of spite? No, I did it for two reasons. First, I wanted to protect EU consumers from bad actors in our industry. I know that the regulator won't. And second, I believe it's vital that the industry bears some of the costs of regulatory failure. In this case, an opportunity cost through losing access to the EU, because it has more influence than we do as consumers. And if the honest majority in the sector realise they have more to gain from effective regulation than from the capture of variety, they will align with us in calling for the situation to be remedied. The case for financial services benefiting from effective regulation, whereas incumbents gain from the capture of variety, is made, in my view, well by Transparency Task Force's response, and again I've linked to it, to the Treasury's consultation on its proposals for the future regulatory framework, which addresses the controversial plan or proposal to give regulators a remit to promote the growth and competitiveness of the UK financial industries. In my view, there should be a zero tolerance approach to corporatism in regulation, politics and the civil service. If we suspect that the Treasury may be subject to capture by city interests, we should act decisively to outlaw revolving door hires, such as one that I've provided a link to in the document, a pretty egregious example of a conflicted revolving door hire. The risk in these is not actually just lobbying. In fact, it's not the lobbying I'm worried about. It's the message that's given out to top civil servants and regulators that that senior civil servants and politicians should think about looking after the bank's interests while notionally serving the public's, in the expectation that the favour will be returned at a future date. It's the economic incentive again. Okay, so the next thing I'd like to talk about is George Patelis. He matters very much. I've mentioned him a number of times in this response. Not only did he make a series of Principle 11 disclosures to the FSA, but he also became a whistleblower to the Funds Action Group, providing us with access to vital evidence which we used to bully the FCA into negotiating the redress payment, partial redress payment from CFM. I know George has provided his own testimony for the call for evidence using a question set designed for whistleblowers. I urge you to place plenty of weight on it. Having known him for almost a decade now, I can assure you that he is a highly intelligent individual of great personal integrity. You may be tempted to dismiss as incredible some of his allegations, which point to the FSA deliberately setting out to allow to continue to trade and to dissipate the fund's money. But I would gladly swear under oath that everything he is telling you is true. Like many whistleblowers, George has suffered a huge emotional and financial toll as a result of doing the right thing, made worse by the regulator not just ignoring his evidence, but subsequently outing him publicly and even blaming him for its own decision not to involve the police when it was blatantly obvious that criminality was occurring and that the fund's investors' money was being appropriated. Any politicians reading this should please do all they can to encourage the FCA to include George in any financial redress package paid to Commonwealth investors and IFAs. He is as much a victim of the regulators' handling of the fund as is any investor. What's more, as a US national, George faces a risk of being sent back to the country of his birth as a result of his career imploding due to his whistleblowing, and also of the FCA outing him. I understand he has applied for leave to remain as an exceptional case. I urge politicians and any other influential stakeholders reading this to write to the Home Office backing his application. And finally, just as George matters very much, so does Transparency Task Force. So in the first couple of years following the fund's collapse, I became aware, I've mentioned this before, of media coverage of other cases in which the financial services industry had treated the public badly, and of regulatory failure, cover or cover up, or some mix of those three, and where these failings seem to be big factors in enabling the harms to take place, and were also obstructing the achievement of redress for the victims and justice for the perpetrators. Having tried without success from 2014 onward to interest the FCA in the concept of reform, I reached the view that there was an unmet need for an umbrella organisation that would bring together victims of misconduct and the action groups that coalesce around specific cases with whistleblowers and other honest actors in the industry who shared the desire for reform. In the absence of such an organisation, I began to work informally with some of the stakeholders, learning and sharing about their cases and sharing their own experiences, and hoping that this might help them to achieve justice. I even toyed with the idea of setting up an umbrella organisation, but lacking the time and resources to do so while effectively fighting for the victims of Connaught, I never got around to it. In late spring 2020, I was introduced to Andy Agafangelo, founder of Transparency Task Force, a campaigning group I was aware of for its work commencing some 5 years earlier on transparency on fees and charges. I decided not to become involved with it back then on the basis that while those campaign goals were valid, I believed there were bigger and more important battles to be fought. By the time I was introduced to Andy, the group had reached the same conclusion, having evolved to challenge all aspects of how financial services treat consumers, its mission statement being, and I quote, to promote the ongoing reform of the financial sector so that it serves society better. I fully endorse that goal, so agreed to become involved. That role has evolved into a voluntary part-time position as its head of strategy and public affairs. In that position, I've met a great many kindred spirits, learned from them, shared my experiences with them, and together we continue to evolve our understanding of the problems and proposals to remedy them. TTF has now evolved into the umbrella organisation I've always felt was needed. It's also the FCA's worst nightmare. More than 5,000 people spread across the globe, comprising misconduct victims, whistleblowers, consumer advocates and honest industry participants who want to reform the sector from within, with a shared intent to pool knowledge and skills to fight for the industry to give the public a better deal. In the UK, which accounts for the majority of members, TTF makes it possible to share experiences of dealing with the FCA, an exercise that often reveals disturbing patterns of behaviour by the regulator. TTF played a significant role in the formation of the All-Party Parliamentary Group on Personal Banking and Fair Financial Services, provides that APPG Secretariat, and is performing a key role in the operation of this call for evidence. Whatever comes out of this exercise, I very much hope that there will be an understanding among politicians that the FCA must become the servant of consumer interests, not the industries. And those consumer interests are best expressed through TTF and not through the FCA's consumer panel or the consumer network, membership of both of which is carefully selected by the FCA. I also hope politicians will reflect on the inequality of arms that exists between consumers and the industry, which may explain some of the FCA's cultural biases. One way in which this imbalance might be lessened might be through the introduction of even very modest amounts of public funding for an umbrella organisation representing consumer interests. If so, I believe that TTF should be that organisation and should be instrumental in the creation of a statutory body such as our proposed Financial Regulators Supervisory Council. A combination of path dependency and network effects mean TTF is already head and shoulders ahead in size, expertise and sapiential authority of any other financial services campaign group in the UK. And it is vital to avert the risk of the FCA or the industry creating an AstroTurf FRSC and presenting it as the authentic voice of consumers. TTF is currently run on a shoestring based on a pay what you can afford membership fee and the occasional donation or support from small grant giving bodies. Many of the big ones are linked to the city one way or another for reasons that may be self-evident. They don't fund TTF. Every week I see examples and more that this amazing organisation could do if given access to even relatively modest amounts of funding. From counselling misconduct victims and whistleblowers facing financial ruin, depression and suicidal thoughts, to judicial reviews of regulatory decisions. There are many wonderful and valuable things it could achieve, but currently can't for want of a relatively modest source of income.
Mark Bishop, thank you very much indeed. We've come to the end of your verbal presentation of your written submission. Thank you very much indeed, Mark, for preparing a very detailed written submission and for presenting it today. As explained at the start of today's conversation, your written submission will be placed on the APPG's website and also the full recording of this conversation with me. Mark Bishop, thank you very, very much indeed. Thank you.